Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, we travel back to a world forgotten by time, where medieval peasants battled not armies, but the sun and sky. How medieval peasants survived deadly droughts is more than history. It's a soft, slow journey through dust and silence, fear and hope. You'll walk barefoot through dry fields, sit beside tired villagers praying for rain, and feel the quiet strength of those who endured without glory. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let this story carry you gently through the past. The night is calm, and the peasants are waiting. The thirsty earth. How medieval peasants survived deadly droughts. The medieval world was shaped by forces far beyond the control of the millions of peasants who worked the land, raised animals, and tended their villages. Among the most relentless challenges they faced was the arrival of drought, long, parching spells of sun and dryness that drained the life from fields, wells, and rivers alike. This segment explores how these deadly droughts swept across medieval Europe, the early signs and terrifying impacts that signaled their arrival, and how peasant communities first struggled and adapted to survive under a relentlessly thirsty earth. The nature of medieval droughts. To understand how medieval peasants endured drought, it's crucial first to grasp what drought meant in their world. Unlike today's complex climate models and meteorological forecasts, medieval farmers relied entirely on experience, oral knowledge, and observation to detect changes in weather patterns. Europe's climate during the Middle Ages was far from stable. It was a patchwork of shifting temperatures and precipitation that varied greatly by region and decade. Droughts could last for months or even years, leaving once fertile fields baked dry, streams reduced to dusty beds, and wells emptied of their precious water. The causes of these droughts were complex. Medieval Europe sat at the mercy of atmospheric phenomena such as changes in solar activity, volcanic eruptions, and the shifting of the jet stream. While modern science can identify these causes, peasants and even the educated clergy of the time only saw their effects: the crops failing, the livestock weakening, the air thick with dust and heat. Medieval chroniclers, monks in monastery scriptoria or local officials, often recorded droughts as a series of omens or punishments from God, linking dry spells to human sins or divine wrath. Yet beyond the spiritual explanations lay stark realities. A drought meant a looming threat of famine and death for the rural population. Early signs and peasant awareness. Peasants were deeply connected to their environment. They had no luxury of ignoring the signs of drought. They noticed the slow disappearance of morning dew, the parching of grass underfoot, and the creeping yellowing of leaves long before the sun scorched the earth. The animals were among the first to show distress. Cows and sheep grazed less, birds vanished from the skies, and the ever-present buzz of insects diminished. One crucial skill was the reading of these signs, passed down from generation to generation. This folk knowledge enabled peasants to anticipate the onset of dry periods. They learned to recognize subtle shifts in wind direction or the scent of the earth. When springs and wells started to falter, alarms grew. The quiet terror of watching the land dry out took hold in village hearts. Drought was not a sudden calamity but a slow, creeping crisis that spread from cracked soil to empty stomachs. Initial responses to the drying earth. Faced with these daunting signs, peasant communities first turned to practical survival measures. Water was the most precious commodity. Villages organized communal efforts to conserve it, often regulating access to wells and streams. In many manners, overseers or village elders would institute water rationing, assigning specific times or quantities for families to collect water. This system, although imperfect and prone to tension, reflected an early form of resource management crucial for survival. In addition to rationing, peasants dug new wells or deepened existing ones, hoping to tap into underground water reserves. These wells were labor-intensive projects, requiring collective effort and often rudimentary tools, but their success could mean the difference between life and death. Crop management also shifted in response to the drought. Farmers chose drought-resistant crops or varieties known to mature quickly before the worst of the dry weather arrived. They staggered planting times to reduce the risk of losing the entire harvest. When fields dried and weeds proliferated, labor focused on weeding and soil care, trying to preserve moisture in the earth through methods like mulching or covering soil with straw. Animal care was equally vital. Livestock required water and pasture, which dwindled quickly in drought conditions. Peasants often culled weaker animals to reduce the herd and preserve the strongest survivors. They supplemented feed with whatever dried grasses or grains they could find, stretching resources to keep animals alive through the hard times. Social and communal dynamics. Survival in drought was not just a matter of individual toil, it was deeply communal. Peasants, though bound by feudal obligations and social hierarchies, relied heavily on mutual aid. Villagers shared grain stores and water reserves when possible, and traditions of gift-giving or reciprocal help strengthened during these crises. In some cases, neighboring villages formed loose alliances to trade resources or share labor on crucial projects like well digging. Yet drought also exacerbated social tensions. Scarce resources bred disputes over land, water rights, and food distribution. Feudal lords, whose income depended on peasant productivity, sometimes raised rents or demanded more labor despite the hardship, fueling resentment and unrest. Spiritual and cultural responses. Amidst practical measures, faith offered hope and a psychological anchor. Medieval peasants were deeply religious, interpreting droughts as divine tests or punishments. Prayer, fasting, and processions to local shrines were common responses. Many villages held ceremonies invoking saints believed to have influence over weather, Saint Medard and Saint Swithin, among others. These rituals offered communities a way to express collective anxiety and maintain social cohesion. Pilgrimages to distant holy sites were sometimes undertaken with the hope of miraculous rains. These acts, while costly, symbolized a profound human need to find meaning and control in an uncontrollable world. Long-term adaptations and resilience. Repeated droughts over years or decades led to adaptations that changed peasant life permanently. Water storage techniques improved, with the construction of cisterns and reservoirs. Crop diversification became more common to spread risk. Agricultural knowledge expanded to include better soil preservation and moisture retention. Drought also influenced settlement patterns. Some villages relocated closer to reliable water sources, while others abandoned marginal lands deemed too risky. These movements reshaped the rural landscape and social geography. Moreover, peasant resilience extended beyond physical survival. Stories, songs, and oral histories preserved the memory of droughts, teaching future generations how to endure. This cultural transmission formed a crucial part of communal identity. In medieval Europe, a peasant's life was completely dependent on the land and the weather. Since they didn't have modern science or weather forecasts, peasants relied on their accumulated knowledge, careful observation, and experience passed down through generations to interpret the natural signs that foretold drought. These signs were often subtle and unfolded gradually over days, weeks, or even months, leaving little room for error or delay in their response. Reading the signs of drought. The first warnings of a coming drought were found in the sky. Clouds, which brought life-giving rain, would thin and disappear, leaving an endless expanse of bright, cloudless blue. This vast, empty sky was a silent and ominous message. The presence or absence of certain cloud formations was crucial. Fluffy cumulus clouds, for example, signaled the possibility of rain, while their absence meant continuing dryness. The sky might have seemed calm, but its silence and clarity masked a slow-moving disaster. Bird behavior also provided an important clue. Birds are highly sensitive to changes in weather and would alter their activity before a drought fully took hold. Normally, birdsong would fill the air at dawn and dusk, and flocks would dart energetically across fields and woodlands. As drought conditions worsened, however, birds became noticeably quieter and less abundant. Some species migrated early, sensing the lack of available food and water. Those that remained showed restless or unusual behaviors, perching in smaller groups or avoiding dry, barren areas. Peasants knew these changes well and used them as indicators of the drying environment. Wind patterns also held significant meaning. Peasants carefully noted the direction, temperature, and moisture content of the breeze. Winds blowing from inland, warm regions often brought hot, dry air, making the parched conditions worse. Conversely, winds from coastal or forested areas could signal a chance of rain or relief. A sudden change to hotter, drier winds, sometimes accompanied by swirling dust, heightened the urgency within the community. On the ground, the signs were even more tangible and devastating. As rain failed to come, fields that had been lush and fertile transformed into barren stretches of cracked earth. Soil, deprived of moisture, hardened into a crust that resisted tilling and planting. These cracks began as thin, spiderweb-like fissures, eventually widening into jagged chasms that threatened the stability of crops and the safety of grazing livestock. The texture and color of the soil changed visibly. Rich dark brown soils lightened to a dusty beige or pale ochre. The surface became dry and powdery, shedding fine dust with every breeze. In some regions, the exposed soil even took on a white, chalky appearance due to the accumulation of salts brought to the surface by evaporation, a condition known as salinization, which further reduced fertility. Crop plants were the most immediate victims. Wheat stalks, once sturdy and green, began to bend and yellow prematurely. Barley heads failed to fill, oats withered, and root vegetables stopped growing, their skins wrinkling under the relentless sun. Peasants would walk among their fields daily, kneeling to inspect the soil and plants, often grasping the stems to assess brittleness and dryness. The health of the crops directly impacted their survival prospects, as harvest failures could mean starvation. Livestock suffered alongside crops. Pastures dried out, turning from lush meadows into dry, brittle grasslands. Animals like sheep, goats, and cattle found less fodder, leading to weight loss, weakness, and increased susceptibility to disease. Water sources shrank or became stagnant and salty, forcing herders to seek out distant streams or wells, sometimes risking dangerous journeys. The scarcity of clean drinking water was particularly severe, and many animals perished or were culled to conserve resources. The quiet terror of a drying land. The emotional and psychological toll on peasants was immense. Unlike sudden catastrophes like floods or fires, drought brought a slow, creeping dread. Villagers experienced a quiet terror, a deep anxiety that settled over daily life as the earth's desiccation progressed. This was a time marked by tense silence and whispered fears, as the community collectively braced for the worst. Despite the hardships, peasants were observant and adaptive. Oral traditions and shared knowledge played a crucial role in their survival strategies. Elders, respected for their wisdom and experience, taught younger generations how to interpret environmental signs. Villagers would gather around fires or at communal wells to discuss changes in weather, animal behavior, and crop conditions, comparing notes and predictions. This collective wisdom helped determine the timing of planting, harvesting, and water management. In addition to natural signs, peasants also relied on the behavior of domesticated animals. Horses and oxen, vital for plowing and transport, displayed restlessness or lethargy depending on their water and feed availability. Dogs might grow uneasy or bark excessively as conditions worsened. Farmers watched closely for these changes, knowing that the animals' reactions could warn of impending hardships. Spiritual beliefs were deeply intertwined with drought experiences. Many peasants believed drought was a form of divine punishment or a test of faith. Rituals, prayers, and offerings to saints and local deities associated with rain and fertility became more frequent. Seasonal festivals that once celebrated abundance transformed into supplications for mercy. Religious leaders often led processions or invoked sacred relics in the hope of bringing relief, reinforcing communal bonds even in despair. Some regions practiced specific drought-related customs. For example, in parts of England, peasants would carry out rain dances or gather to ring church bells in a rhythmic pattern believed to encourage rain. In other areas, sacrifices or symbolic acts, such as planting a witch's tree or performing rituals at holy wells, were part of the cultural response. The environmental changes also demanded practical adaptations. Peasants began to conserve water wherever possible, collecting morning dew on cloths or scraping moisture from leaves. Water from wells was carefully rationed, with strict communal rules to ensure fair distribution. Some villages dug deeper wells or built cisterns to capture and store rainwater during wetter periods. Agricultural practices shifted as well. Crops that were more drought-resistant or had shorter growing seasons gained favor during dry spells. Farmers might prioritize legumes or hardy grains over water-intensive plants. In some cases, fields were left fallow to conserve moisture, or crop rotations were adjusted to maintain soil health. Socially, droughts could strain village cohesion but also prompted cooperation. Communities sometimes pooled resources, sharing food, water, and labor to support those hardest hit. Bartering increased as peasants traded goods to offset shortages. However, prolonged droughts could also lead to conflicts over scarce resources or migration in search of better conditions. The village well runs low. Water conservation and creative solutions. In the medieval countryside, water was the lifeblood of every village. When the skies withheld their blessing and the rains failed to fall, the heart of peasant survival was the village well, a precious source of life that often became dangerously depleted during deadly droughts. Without the wells, crops would fail, animals would perish, and people themselves would face thirst, sickness, and death. Understanding how medieval peasants managed their water supply during these times reveals much about their resilience, ingenuity, and communal spirit. The central role of the village well. Most medieval villages depended on a communal well, dug to access groundwater near the surface. These wells were vital for drinking, cooking, watering animals, and irrigating kitchen gardens. Often simple in construction, sometimes just a deep hole lined with stone or wood, the well's health was a barometer for the village's survival. When drought struck, the well was the first casualty. As rainfall ceased for weeks or months, the water table dropped, the well water became scarce, and its quality deteriorated, turning brackish or muddy. Maintaining the well's cleanliness was crucial during drought. Contaminated water could lead to outbreaks of disease like dysentery or cholera, which were deadly and could wipe out whole families. Peasants knew to avoid throwing waste or dead animals near the well. In many villages, strict rules governed access to the well and its protection, enforced by village elders or church authorities. Water rationing, a community imperative. As the well ran low, rationing became an unavoidable necessity. Peasants were acutely aware that once the well dried up completely, survival became nearly impossible. To prevent this, the village leadership often established rationing systems, sometimes formalized by local manorial courts or village assemblies. These rules controlled who could take water, how much they could collect, and for what purposes. Water was prioritized first and foremost for drinking and cooking. This was the sacred minimum needed to keep people alive. Washing, cleaning, and irrigation were secondary uses and often heavily restricted or suspended altogether. For example, villagers were instructed to minimize laundry, wash themselves less frequently, and avoid washing floors or animals unless absolutely necessary. To enforce rationing, some villages assigned specific times during the day for families or households to draw water from the well. This avoided long queues, disputes, and potential hoarding by more assertive individuals. Sometimes, village officials or respected elders supervised the well to monitor fair use and deter cheating. Children and the elderly often had designated times or special privileges, recognizing their greater vulnerability. These social regulations helped maintain order and cooperation during an otherwise stressful and dangerous time. Creative water conservation techniques. Beyond rationing, peasants developed ingenious ways to conserve and reuse water, reflecting a deep practical understanding of their environment. Greywater reuse was common, where water used for washing clothes or utensils was not discarded but collected in barrels or pits for secondary use, usually to water plants, gardens, or animals. This early form of recycling helped stretch the limited water supply and reduce the need to draw fresh water from the well. Rainwater harvesting, although more common in later periods, was practiced where possible. Villagers placed containers, barrels, or woven baskets beneath roof eaves to catch whatever sparse rainfall did occur, even if only dew or light showers. Some homes had rudimentary guttering made from wood or split bark to channel water into cisterns. This water was carefully rationed and used for non-potable needs. Household routines changed drastically to reduce water consumption. Bathing was minimized, sometimes becoming a communal event where several family members bathed together in a single basin. Clothes washing was done only when visibly necessary, often by beating rather than soaking, to reduce water use. Cooking methods adapted as well. Stews and soups that required large amounts of water were replaced by dry roasted grains or baked goods. Preservation techniques, such as salting and drying, helped store food that did not require water for preparation. Agricultural water management. The pressure on water extended beyond the home to the fields, where survival depended on crops. Medieval peasants were keenly aware of the soil's thirst and used several strategies to reduce water loss in their gardens and small fields. One technique was mulching, covering the soil around crops with straw, leaves, or even grass clippings. This organic layer helped reduce evaporation, kept soil temperatures cooler, and slowed down the drying process. Mulching was a low-cost, effective way to protect crops during drought. Peasants also created small, shallow ditches or furrows around their plots to capture and channel any available water directly to plant roots, minimizing wastage. These water-conserving furrows could also trap dew overnight, adding moisture slowly to the soil. Where wells allowed, peasants dug irrigation trenches to distribute water to critical crops during the early morning or evening when evaporation was minimal. However, during severe droughts, irrigation water was scarce and reserved only for the most vital crops or seedlings. Crop choices themselves sometimes reflected water availability. Peasants favored drought-tolerant grains like barley or rye over thirstier wheat varieties. Root vegetables such as turnips and carrots, which needed less water, became staples when rain failed. Deepening wells and searching for water. When the village well showed signs of running dry, villagers often undertook the arduous task of deepening it. This was labor-intensive and dangerous work. Digging deeper into soft earth or rock without modern tools exposed workers to the risk of collapse, poison gases, or flooding. Yet the risk was often worth the effort, as even a small increase in well depth could access previously untapped water reserves. In some cases, if the well was completely exhausted or contaminated, villagers sought to dig a new well in a different location, guided by local knowledge of underground springs or softer soil. Choosing a good well site was a skill passed down through generations, sometimes involving rudimentary divining rods or the consultation of experienced elders. If local groundwater failed entirely, peasants resorted to sending messengers to neighboring villages or towns with better water supplies. These journeys were fraught with risk, from bandit attacks to exhaustion. Sometimes water was traded or borrowed in barrels, creating a fragile network of survival that depended on social ties beyond the immediate village. Social and religious dimensions. Water scarcity was not just a physical challenge but also a social and spiritual crisis. The communal nature of water resources often brought villagers closer, reinforcing bonds of mutual aid and collective responsibility. However, drought also exposed social inequalities. Wealthier peasants or local lords might have private wells or cisterns, or access to rivers and streams, leaving poorer villagers more vulnerable. In some cases, this inequality caused tensions or conflicts over water rights. Religion played a profound role in how peasants understood and coped with drought. Many villagers believed drought was a punishment for sin or a test from God. Prayer, fasting, and religious processions to sacred springs or wells were common, seeking divine intervention to bring rain. Holy wells were pilgrimage sites, believed to have healing powers or the ability to summon rain clouds. Church authorities often reminded peasants to conserve water and live humbly during drought, tying practical advice with moral teaching. Saints associated with water, such as Saint Medard or Saint Brigid, were invoked during drought prayers. Watering livestock and food security. Water rationing extended beyond humans to animals critical for medieval peasants' survival: cows, pigs, chickens, and horses. These animals provided food, labor, and manure for fields. Watering livestock with minimal water, sometimes using gray water or morning dew, was a delicate balancing act. Too little water risked animal illness or death, too much threatened depletion of the village supply. Animals were sometimes kept in shaded areas or brought closer to water sources during the hottest parts of the day. Farmers monitored livestock health closely, culling weak animals to conserve resources. Food security during drought depended heavily on managing animal survival alongside crops. Many peasants stored grains and hay in advance, but prolonged drought threatened these reserves, forcing difficult decisions about rationing or selling livestock. Conclusion: resilience amidst scarcity. Throughout medieval droughts, peasants relied on a combination of strict rationing, communal cooperation, ingenious reuse of water, agricultural adaptations, and spiritual hope to survive the depletion of their village wells. Though the threat was ever present and often deadly, these strategies reveal a remarkable capacity to endure and adapt in the face of environmental hardship. Food scarcity during drought. A peasant's struggle for survival. The arrival of a drought in medieval Europe was not merely a bad season for farmers, it profoundly disrupted the very fabric of rural existence. For peasants, whose lives were tied closely to the land, the failure of crops was a terrifying event with immediate consequences. Grain, the foundation of the medieval diet, was particularly vulnerable to dry spells. Unlike modern drought-resistant varieties, medieval strains of rye, barley, oats, and wheat lacked resilience to prolonged water shortages. The parched soil cracked open, crops shriveled on stalks, and once promising fields turned to dust. When the harvest failed, the steady rhythm of daily life was broken, forcing peasants to rethink what little food they had and how to make it last. Stretching every morsel, the evolution of bread. Bread was the staple of every peasant household, but in a drought year, it became a scarce and precious resource. The grain that survived the dry months was often small, uneven, and nutritionally poor, leading to flour that was coarse and difficult to work with. Bakers and housewives resorted to ingenious methods to stretch the limited flour. They would mix the precious grain with fillers, often foraged or gathered from wild plants, to bulk out the dough. Acorns, chestnuts, and even ground tree bark were sometimes added to flour mixtures, imparting bitterness but extending the volume of bread. These mock breads were often denser and less palatable, but they represented the difference between starvation and survival. Loaves were baked thinly to maximize the number of pieces that could be shared. Peasants would also dry out old bread, turning it into a kind of hard biscuit that could be stored and used for months, often soaked in broths or pottage to soften it for eating. Dietary transformations, from scarcity to ingenuity. The transformation of the diet during drought was marked not just by scarcity but by necessity and adaptation. With grain scarce, peasants shifted to watery dishes like pottage, a thick vegetable stew that could be stretched with wild greens and foraged plants. Root vegetables, when available, became the cornerstone of these meals. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, and onions were boiled, mashed, or roasted to make what little food they had more filling. The nutritional value of these meals was limited, but they provided vital bulk and moisture. Legumes, such as dried peas and beans, were another important ingredient, valued for their protein content and ability to be stored for long periods. However, drought conditions could also affect these crops, limiting their availability. Foraging became a crucial part of survival. The woods, hedgerows, and common lands around villages offered a refuge of edible plants, herbs, and roots. Peasants were knowledgeable about their local flora, understanding which wild greens were safe to eat and which had medicinal or culinary value. Nettles, for example, rich in iron and vitamins, were gathered and boiled, while dandelion leaves added bitterness and nutrition. Wild garlic and sorrel were used to flavor otherwise bland meals. Berries such as elderberries, blackberries, and crab apples were collected in season, though these were often insufficient in quantity to fully supplement the diet. Mushrooms, when found, were a valuable protein source but required careful identification to avoid poisonous varieties. Gourds, pumpkins, and squashes were sometimes cultivated or gathered from wild plants, prized for their ability to survive dry spells better than leafy greens or grains. These vegetables stored well over the winter months in cellars or pits dug into shaded earth, providing a reliable food source when fresh crops failed. Their thick skins protected the flesh inside from rot and pests. Cooking gourds required effort, often roasting or boiling, but their flesh was filling and could be combined with other ingredients to make stews more substantial. The plight of livestock and supplementary foods. Livestock, which had always been a luxury for most peasants, was severely affected by drought. Animals needed water and fodder, both of which became scarce. Many peasants kept small flocks of chickens, goats, or pigs, but during droughts, feeding these animals became difficult. Pasture dried up, and peasants had to ration fodder or rely on crop residues, further reducing the food available for humans. Some were forced to slaughter weaker animals earlier than usual, sacrificing future milk and labor for immediate meat. Meat was never a staple in the peasant diet, but during drought, its availability dwindled further, exacerbating malnutrition. When available, hunting small game such as rabbits, hares, and birds became vital. Traps and snares were set near forest edges or along known animal trails. Fishing supplemented diets where rivers or lakes retained some water, but reduced water levels and increased sediment made fishing less fruitful. Dairy products, a small but important part of peasant nutrition, were also limited. Goats and cows produced less milk as drought depleted pastures, and the production of butter and cheese declined accordingly. Cheese, especially hard, aged varieties, was a valuable preserved food, but its creation depended on sufficient milk supplies. When dairy was unavailable, peasants relied even more on grains and foraged foods. Preservation and social implications. Preserving whatever food they had was critical. Drying and smoking were common preservation methods for meat, fish, and herbs, but the availability of salt, a key preservative, depended on trade routes that could be disrupted by drought and famine. Root vegetables and gourds stored underground in cool, dark places allowed peasants to access some fresh food in winter or times of scarcity. Fermentation was practiced in some regions, producing sour breads or pickled vegetables that could last longer than fresh produce. The social implications of food scarcity during drought were profound. Villages often relied on communal grain stores or shared wells, but when these were depleted, tensions rose. Food was rationed carefully, with priority often given to the most vulnerable: children, the elderly, and the infirm. Starvation and malnutrition were harsh realities for many, leading to weakened immune systems and increased mortality from disease. Peasants might barter their labor or small possessions for grain or food, but prices could skyrocket during drought, making it difficult for the poorest families to obtain sufficient sustenance. Despite hardship, many communities emphasized cooperation, pooling resources to stave off the worst effects of famine. Faith and resilience. Religion played a vital role in how peasants understood and endured food shortages. Many interpreted drought as a divine punishment for sins, prompting prayers, fasting, and ceremonies aimed at appeasing God or saints. Religious festivals and rituals often focused on agricultural cycles, and during drought, these gatherings were opportunities to appeal collectively for rain and fertility. Such spiritual practices reinforced communal bonds and gave hope amid suffering. Stories, songs, and proverbs about hunger and endurance circulated, preserving knowledge and encouraging resilience. The drought's impact on diet and survival strategies reveals the adaptability and determination of medieval peasants. Their lives depended on a delicate balance of agriculture, foraging, animal husbandry, and social cooperation. When faced with dead fields and empty granaries, they drew on generations of knowledge about the land and nature. The grain, though scarce, was stretched through ingenuity. The gourd and wild plants supplemented fragile diets, and the community's will to survive forged bonds that outlasted the dry years. Though the droughts brought great suffering, they also highlighted the resourcefulness of a people intimately tied to the earth, whose very survival hinged on endurance, adaptability, and hope. Oral traditions. Nature's clues for drought prediction. In the close-knit world of medieval peasantry, survival depended on an intimate relationship with nature. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was passed through generations via stories told by firesides and whispered in fields. Without modern forecasting tools, peasants developed an extensive system of oral traditions and weather lore to read the subtle signs of coming drought. This collective wisdom, while not scientifically rigorous, was a refined understanding of nature's rhythms, a language spoken by the wind, birds, insects, and the very earth. The language of weather lore. This weather wisdom was more than just practical knowledge. It was a sacred trust, guarded by village elders, shepherds, and farmers who had learned to listen deeply. This lore was often conveyed through poetic sayings, rhymes, and proverbs based on years of observation. For example, when the swallow flies low, rain is soon to flow, might signal upcoming wet weather, while red skies at night, shepherd's delight, red skies in morning, shepherd's warning, guided peasants on whether to expect dryness or a storm. However, when these signs failed and skies remained stubbornly clear for weeks, fear would grip the villagers, knowing severe consequences awaited. Nature's silent messengers. Among the earliest signs of drought were changes in bird behavior. Swallows, starlings, and other small birds acted as natural barometers. Their flight patterns, nesting habits, and vocalizations shifted noticeably as the air dried out. Peasants observed when birds stopped singing at dawn or ceased their usual afternoon chatter, sensing a hush in the natural world that foreshadowed hardship. Even the early retreat of migratory birds, or their failure to arrive as expected, caused worry. This avian language was woven into stories told by grandparents, teaching children the importance of observing nature. Insects, too, played a part in this unspoken dialogue. The abundance or scarcity of certain insects, like crickets or cicadas, was carefully noted. Their songs, almost musical in the quiet heat of summer, were said to rise in pitch and volume as humidity increased but fell silent as the earth hardened. Locusts or grasshoppers, when seen in large numbers, were ominous harbingers of drought and potential crop devastation. Peasants watched with anxious eyes as these creatures gathered in fields, understanding the delicate balance between their life cycles and the health of the land. The sky itself was read with acute attention. Clear, cloudless mornings were a blessing at the start of the growing season but became a harbinger of drought when they stretched into weeks or months. Peasants observed cloud types, noting their shapes and movements. Wispy cirrus clouds promised rain, while red or orange hues at sunset were taken as warnings. The wind was not just a breeze, it was a messenger. A steady east wind might bring dry weather, while a sudden stillness or a shift in direction signaled changing conditions. These observations were encoded in folk rhymes and legends, giving structure to the peasants' otherwise uncertain existence. The earth itself provided clues. As soil moisture dwindled, cracks appeared in fields, and the dirt's texture changed underfoot. Peasants knew from experience how to test the soil with their hands, feeling for dryness that would imperil their crops. Early wilting in plants, a dullness in leaf color, or the premature dropping of leaves on trees warned that water was running low. Wild herbs were also indicators. Some plants would flower early or fail to bloom, signaling shifts in seasonal patterns. These natural phenomena became a language of survival, guiding farmers on when to sow, irrigate, and prepare for scarcity. The power of collective memory and community. Oral traditions also included accounts of past droughts and their effects, passed down as cautionary tales. These stories were more than memories. They were lessons etched into the village's collective consciousness. Elders would recount years when rains and crops failed, and entire communities faced hunger. These narratives reinforced the importance of vigilance and community action. They described rituals performed to invoke rain, prayers offered at the local church or shrine, and communal efforts to share scarce resources. Such tales fostered resilience and collective responsibility, encouraging peasants to support each other in hardship. Reliance on nature's signs was a double-edged sword. Sometimes, the lore was accurate, allowing peasants to adapt farming practices, planting drought-resistant crops, conserving water, or seeking alternative food sources. But other times, predictions failed, or droughts struck suddenly, overwhelming traditional knowledge. Even so, this lore was central to peasant identity, connecting them to ancestors and Earth's cycles. It was a reminder that while humans were at the mercy of elements, they were also participants in an ancient dialogue with the natural world. In some regions, weather lore intertwined with superstition and ritual. Certain days were considered more favorable for planting or harvesting, based on lunar cycles or saints' feast days. Farmers might consult local wise women or herbalists who combined plant knowledge with weather predictions. These figures often held important social roles, bridging practical farming advice with spiritual guidance. Amulets, charms, and prayers were common, reflecting a worldview where the physical and spiritual were inseparable in the quest for survival. Despite limitations, these oral traditions were remarkably sophisticated. Peasants could often detect patterns invisible to outsiders, how a particular bird's call shifted with atmospheric pressure or how a sudden change in wind direction coincided with impending drought. These subtle observations allowed for a degree of preparedness, even if imperfect. The very act of gathering to share weather lore reinforced social bonds and collective memory, creating a web of mutual support. Ultimately, the whispers in the wind and the tales told beneath the stars were a testament to the resourcefulness and endurance of medieval peasants. Faced with deadly droughts that threatened their existence, they turned to the natural world as both guide and teacher. Their survival depended not just on crop strength or granary size, but on their ability to listen to birds, insects, clouds, and the earth itself, and to trust the wisdom passed down through countless seasons. This intimate relationship with nature, encoded in oral tradition and weather lore, was one of their most vital tools against the uncertainty of drought. Religious responses. Faith tested under a silent sky. In medieval Europe, where life's rhythms were deeply intertwined with faith, drought was not merely a natural calamity but a profound spiritual trial. When skies refused to weep and the earth cracked under the relentless sun, peasants looked upward, seeking solace and divine intervention. The heavens' silence was deafening, shaking their faith's foundations. Yet, in this silence, prayer and ritual became the lifeblood of hope. Rituals rich with symbolism and community, processions winding through parched fields, and invocations of saints believed to wield power to summon rain. These religious responses were as crucial for survival as rationing water or changing crops. They sustained the spirit when the body was weakest. Drought as divine displeasure. Medieval peasants lived in a world where the sacred and the secular were inseparable. The church was not just a place of worship but a central institution governing daily life, a source of moral guidance, and a community hub. When drought struck, it was interpreted not only as a test of endurance but as a possible sign of divine displeasure. Perhaps the village's sins, neglect of proper observance, or failure to heed holy days had provoked God's wrath. This belief imbued drought with a moral dimension. Survival depended not only on earthly measures but on spiritual penitence and collective supplication. Rituals, prayers, and processions. At the heart of this religious response were the rituals, acts performed by both clergy and laity to appeal to God's mercy. The simplest were earnest, repeated prayers, beseeching the skies to open and refresh the land. Families gathered in homes or at the village church, reciting psalms and litanies dedicated to rain. Sacred words repetition was thought to carry power, creating a spiritual rhythm that might pierce the heavens' silence. Children learned these prayers as a matter of course, growing up with a deep sense that faith was their shield against nature's unpredictable forces. More elaborate were the processions, public displays of faith designed to invoke divine intervention. Entire villages might march together, carrying crosses, holy relics, or banners emblazoned with saints' images, winding through fields already brown and brittle. The communal nature of these processions was vital. It was a demonstration of unity and shared responsibility, a physical act of bringing people and their prayers closer to God. These marches often concluded at the local church or a shrine dedicated to a particular saint, where further prayers and ceremonies took place. Processions could last hours, sometimes days, and were accompanied by chants, hymns, and ringing church bells, each sound meant to awaken the heavens from their indifferent silence. The intercession of saints. Saints played a crucial role in these religious practices, serving as heavenly advocates who could intercede on behalf of the suffering. Certain saints became synonymous with rain and fertility, their feast days eagerly anticipated and marked with special ceremonies. Saint Medard, for instance, was widely venerated across medieval Europe as a patron against drought. Peasants believed that if it rained on his feast day, the coming summer would be blessed with ample water. Similarly, Saint Swithin was invoked in England, with folklore asserting that rain on his feast day meant 40 days of rain to come. These beliefs connected church calendar cycles with nature's cycles, intertwining religious observance with agricultural expectations. The rituals often involved more than prayers and processions. Holy water was sprinkled over fields and wells to sanctify the land, while relics of saints were brought out in times of extreme need. These objects, bones, clothing, or items believed to have belonged to saints, were treated with immense reverence, their presence thought to channel divine power. A relic's touch was believed to have healing properties for both people and land, and stories circulated of entire villages saved from drought through miraculous intercession associated with these sacred objects. Faith under duress. Faith under drought was a complex and sometimes fraught experience. While many found strength in these religious practices, the persistence of a silent sky tested even the most devout. Doubt and despair crept into hearts alongside hope. Clergy faced their own struggles to maintain confidence and inspire their congregations. Sermons often addressed drought as a spiritual trial, a call to repentance and renewal of faith. Priests reminded peasants that suffering had its place in God's plan and that perseverance and piety would ultimately bring relief. This message was both a comfort and a challenge, urging the faithful to see beyond immediate hardship. In some instances, drought fueled tensions within communities. When prayers seemed unanswered, accusations of sin or witchcraft occasionally surfaced, as people sought explanations for their suffering. Those believed to be outside communal norms, widows, healers, or social outcasts, might be scapegoated, blamed for angering the divine through curses or dark magic. These fears intertwined with the very real desperation caused by failing crops and empty wells. The Church's role was critical in moderating these tensions, emphasizing forgiveness, communal prayer, and charity rather than division. The endurance of these religious responses was remarkable, reflecting the deep-seated belief that the natural world was governed by divine will. Drought was not seen as a mere meteorological event but as a message from God, one that demanded attention, humility, and action. The rituals themselves, whether simple or elaborate, provided a sense of agency and participation in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. They reinforced community bonds, ensuring that peasants did not face the crisis in isolation but as part of a collective seeking salvation. Pilgrimages and community bonds. Moreover, the religious calendar shaped agricultural rhythms. Holy days and festivals offered breaks in labor and moments of communal gathering that reinforced social cohesion. During drought, these gatherings gained even greater significance, providing psychological relief and a framework for expressing collective anxiety and hope. Music, dance, and feasting on feast days, though sometimes curtailed by scarcity, remained essential for maintaining morale. The church's teachings on charity and care for the poor also prompted wealthier villagers or local lords to provide aid when possible, though such support was often limited. Pilgrimages to shrines famed for miraculous rain or fertility cures became a desperate recourse in the worst droughts. Peasants, sometimes in groups or individually, traveled long distances on foot to places like the Shrine of Our Lady of Rocamadour in France or St. James's Cathedral in Santiago de Compostela. These journeys were both physical and spiritual acts of devotion, embodying hope and the search for divine favor. The accounts of pilgrims returning with tales of answered prayers added to the collective lore and reinforced belief in the power of faith. In sum, the religious responses to drought among medieval peasants were deeply rooted in a worldview that saw the divine as intimately involved in everyday life. Prayer, ritual, and faith offered more than hope. They provided a framework for understanding suffering and a means of coping with the unpredictability of the natural world. Under the unyielding sun and silent skies, these acts of devotion formed a vital lifeline, binding communities together and sustaining them through some of their darkest seasons. How homes, roofs, and rain barrels protected precious water. In the harsh reality of medieval droughts, every drop of water was an invaluable treasure. Peasants, whose survival depended heavily on the land's resources, understood this profoundly. Their homes, simple, often humble structures built with natural materials, became not just shelters but essential tools in the battle against water scarcity. Beneath the thatch and sky, peasants developed ingenious, if modest, methods to capture, conserve, and protect precious water, using their roofs and rudimentary storage vessels to stretch what little moisture the parched land might yield. Roofs as water catchment systems. Medieval peasant houses were typically small, constructed with timber frames, wattle and daub walls, and thatched roofs made from straw, reeds, or rushes. These materials were locally available and affordable. While not perfectly impermeable, these thick, layered roofs offered excellent insulation. During a drought, however, their role extended beyond shelter and warmth. Peasants learned to use their roofs as catchment areas, capitalizing on infrequent rains to collect as much water as possible before it evaporated under the relentless sun. The concept was simple yet effective. When rain finally fell, it would drip and run down the sloping thatch into channels or gutters fashioned from wood or hollowed logs. These rudimentary gutters guided the water into containers placed strategically around the home. In some cases, hollowed-out wooden barrels, clay pots, or stone cisterns served as storage vessels. These containers were often located near the house's entrance or just beyond, in shaded areas where evaporation was slower. Even a brief shower was eagerly anticipated, as it replenished these precious stores. Because roofs were not always perfectly waterproof, leaks sometimes occurred. Peasants adapted by placing vessels inside homes or under eaves to catch drips. The dark interiors and earthen floors of homes also helped reduce water loss through evaporation. In some cases, large shallow basins made of wood or ceramic were positioned to hold collected rainwater for immediate use in cooking, washing, or watering small garden patches. The vital role of rain barrels in water conservation. Rain barrels, though primitive by today's standards, were an essential feature of water management in drought-prone areas. These barrels were often handmade by local coopers, craftsmen skilled in shaping wooden staves into watertight containers held by iron hoops. The barrels varied in size but were generally large enough to hold several dozen gallons, offering a critical reserve for times when natural water sources ran dry. Because of their value, barrels were carefully maintained and sometimes covered with lids or cloth to prevent contamination by dust, leaves, or insects. Preserving the cleanliness of stored water was vital. Peasants understood that stagnant water could become a breeding ground for illness. To mitigate this, barrels were cleaned regularly, and covers helped protect against debris. Sometimes herbs with antiseptic qualities, like mint or thyme, were added to the water. These measures reflected practical knowledge gained through experience rather than formal scientific understanding. Besides rainwater catchment, homes also served as places for water conservation through daily habits. Peasants collected leftover water from cooking or washing and reused it for plants or animals, minimizing waste. Buckets and basins were kept close at hand, and children were taught early to be careful with water. Every drop spilled was mourned, a lesson learned from harsh necessity rather than parental admonition alone. The design of homes themselves reflected adaptations to drought conditions. Thick earthen walls and thatched roofs insulated interiors from heat, reducing the need for water to cool living spaces. Windows were small, limiting sun exposure and thereby reducing the drying effects of heat inside the home. The hearth, often the home's heart, was carefully managed to prevent unnecessary smoke or heat that could increase thirst and dehydration. Community efforts and enduring wisdom. In some regions, peasants constructed specialized water storage pits or cisterns near their homes. These were dug into the earth and lined with clay or stone to retain moisture and prevent seepage. Covered with wooden planks or thatch to reduce evaporation, these cisterns were vital in times of drought, serving as supplementary water reserves when rain barrels ran low. Maintenance of these pits was a communal task, as contamination or damage could affect neighboring households. Gardens surrounding homes were another critical element in water management during droughts. Peasants planted drought-resistant crops or herbs close to the house, making use of any available water reserves. The close proximity meant watering was easier and less wasteful. Mulching with straw or leaves helped retain soil moisture. Some peasants even collected dew in the early morning using cloths stretched over frames, wringing them out to gather small amounts of water for delicate plants or personal use. The importance of protecting water sources was understood not only on a practical level but also within the community's social fabric. Wells, springs, and rain barrels were guarded carefully, with social norms discouraging waste or theft. In some villages, strict rules governed the use of communal water reserves, enforced by local elders or church officials. Violators risked social ostracism or penalties, reflecting the critical nature of water access during drought times. Water management strategies were often shared orally, passed down through generations as part of the community's collective wisdom. Mothers taught children how to care for water containers, how to spot leaks, and how to prioritize water use. This knowledge was practical, rooted in observation and trial, adapted to local climates and materials. Each village developed its own methods suited to its environment. What worked in a damp valley might be useless on a dry plateau. The survival of medieval peasants during droughts was therefore not just about the soil or crops but intimately connected to the spaces they called home. The humble peasant house was a microcosm of resilience, where architecture and daily practice merged to conserve life's most precious resource. Beneath the thatch and open sky, survival depended on careful stewardship of water, on rituals of collection and protection that were as natural to peasants as planting or harvesting. Through these efforts, peasants carved out pockets of moisture in a thirsty land. Their homes became sanctuaries of water, tiny reservoirs of hope against a backdrop of cracked earth and barren fields. This intimate relationship with their dwellings ensured that when the rains came again, however sporadic, the village was ready to capture, conserve, and survive until the next storm. Water was life, and beneath the thatch and sky, medieval peasants did everything within their power to hold on to it. The lord's land, the peasant's burden, feudal obligations during drought. The medieval world was shaped not only by nature's cycles but also by the unyielding structures of feudal society. For peasants enduring deadly droughts, the burden of survival was not theirs alone. The land they toiled belonged to lords, and even in the harshest seasons, the obligations to these landlords, tithes, taxes, and rents, remained stubbornly constant. The drought that withered crops and cracked the earth did not pause to ease the toll of these demands. In fact, it often intensified the hardship of medieval peasants, for the lord's land and his claims overshadowed every aspect of rural life, especially during times of scarcity. Unyielding demands in times of scarcity. The feudal system was fundamentally a relationship of power and duty. Lords granted peasants the right to work portions of their land in exchange for services and payments. This exchange was rarely generous or forgiving, and drought only deepened the inequality. When rains failed and harvests faltered, peasants found themselves trapped in a cruel dilemma. their fields produced less or nothing at all, yet the tithe, the mandatory portion of their produce owed to the church and the Lord, remained fixed. This obligation could mean surrendering a tenth of a meager harvest or, worse, paying in other ways when crops were too scant. Drought brought the land and its laborers to their knees, but the demands of feudal dues did not yield to hardship. Lords expected their rents and tithes, enforced by stewards and local officials whose livelihoods depended on upholding these dues. The peasants' burden was tangible, surrendering what little food or grain they had to survive on, often leaving families to face starvation. The tension between feudal obligation and survival created a landscape of anxiety and despair, as peasants struggled to balance duty with the instinct to protect their own lives. Some lords, driven by pragmatism or perhaps a sense of harsh justice, attempted to enforce these dues rigidly regardless of circumstance. When harvests failed, peasants sometimes resorted to borrowing seed or food from neighbors or local markets, indebting themselves further. In some cases, they might sell personal possessions, including tools, livestock, or even household items, to meet their obligations. The social cost was high. Selling essential implements undermined their ability to farm in the future, deepening the cycle of poverty. Limited mercy and compounded burdens. Others among the nobility showed limited mercy, allowing for temporary reductions in dues or postponements. These concessions, however, were rare and often accompanied by increased pressure in other forms, extra labor services, fines, or the threat of eviction. The lord's interest was preserving the estate's productivity and revenue, not the peasants' welfare. The peasants, for their part, learned to negotiate these harsh realities, sometimes petitioning local courts or church authorities for relief, though success was far from guaranteed. Religious obligations compounded the material burdens. The church, closely tied to the feudal hierarchy, collected tithes for itself, typically a tenth of produce or income, regardless of how barren the fields had become. This was justified by the belief that spiritual duties transcended earthly misfortune and that the church's support was essential for communal salvation. Yet for starving peasants, handing over grain or livestock meant trading physical sustenance for spiritual assurance, a costly exchange in the face of drought. Peasant villages functioned as tightly knit communities where survival depended on mutual support, but the presence of feudal demands often strained these bonds. When the land yielded little, and obligations loomed large, neighbors might find themselves competing for scarce resources rather than sharing. The social fabric frayed under the weight of economic stress, and disputes over dues, boundaries, and rights became common. Lords and their agents capitalized on these tensions, using them to reinforce control and suppress dissent. Strategies for survival and enduring resilience. To manage these pressures, peasants employed various strategies. Some sought to maximize their yields despite drought by intensifying labor on the lord's domain, the part of the land directly controlled by the lord and farmed by peasants as part of their service. This extra work was both a duty and a survival tactic. Failure to perform could lead to harsh penalties, eviction, or loss of access to land. Increasing effort on meager soil was exhausting and often futile, but was seen as necessary to maintain their tenuous hold on property and status. Others diversified their labor to include tasks less dependent on the land's fertility, such as weaving, basket making, or seasonal work in nearby towns. These side occupations provided supplementary income or goods to barter, helping offset losses from poor harvests. However, opportunities for such work were limited, especially for peasants bound by serfdom or tied to the land through customary obligations. In some regions, communal systems provided a buffer. Peasant villages collectively managed common lands, woodlands, pastures, and marshes, where families could graze animals, collect firewood, or forage. During droughts, these commons became crucial survival spaces, offering alternatives to failed crops. Yet even these resources were vulnerable to depletion, and lords often asserted control over commons, restricting access to maintain their own interests. The justice system reinforced the lord's authority during drought crises. Peasants who failed to meet their dues or violated rules regarding land use could be fined, imprisoned, or subjected to corporal punishment. The law was seldom in their favor, and appeals were costly and time-consuming. In desperate cases, peasants faced eviction, losing the very land that sustained them and forcing migration or dependence on charity. These harsh realities did not go unnoticed by contemporary chroniclers or church officials, who sometimes lamented the plight of peasants under the twin pressures of nature and feudalism. Some advocated for leniency, especially in times of famine or drought, urging lords to temper justice with mercy. However, structural change was slow and rare, and the fundamental inequalities of feudal life endured. Despite the weight of obligation, peasants exhibited remarkable resilience. Their survival during deadly droughts depended not only on managing scarce water and food but also on navigating the complex social and economic demands imposed by the feudal system. They learned to balance submission with subtle resistance, negotiating payments, pooling resources, or quietly defying unjust orders. The survival of families and communities required both endurance and ingenuity. In the face of these burdens, the village itself became a place of solidarity and shared hardship. Communal work parties, cooperative labor on lords' fields, and collective efforts to store and distribute scarce food and water reflected a pragmatic response to systemic pressures. Rituals of mutual aid, shared meals, and joint maintenance of infrastructure such as wells and roads helped maintain social cohesion even as the drought tested their limits. The lord's land was a constant reminder of power and possession, but beneath that shadow, peasants carved out lives defined by persistence and adaptation. Deadly droughts magnified the hardships inherent in their world, yet through labor, negotiation, and community, medieval peasants sought to survive the weight of obligation while preserving what little they could from the barren earth. The hollow harvest. How medieval peasants survived deadly droughts. When the sun scorched the fields relentlessly and the rains failed to fall, medieval peasants faced the stark reality of the hollow harvest. This was a season marked by bare barns, cracked soil, and a deepening anxiety that gnawed at every household. The harvest was the lifeblood of peasant survival. A successful yield meant the difference between relative comfort and the threat of starvation. Yet during deadly droughts, crops withered before they could ripen, leaving fields barren and families scrambling for alternatives. The failure of the harvest was not merely an agricultural setback but a crisis that rippled through every aspect of peasant life, forcing desperate innovation and grim determination. In normal years, the rhythms of sowing, tending, and harvesting defined the calendar of rural communities. Seed was sown in early spring, tended through summer, and harvested in late summer or early autumn. But drought disrupted this cycle in cruel ways. Early signs of failed germination, seeds that refused to sprout or young shoots that shriveled in the sun, heralded disaster. Fields that once promised golden waves of grain lay dusty and bare. Barley, rye, oats, and wheat, the staples of the medieval peasant diet, suffered immensely under drought's relentless grip. Without these grains, bread and porridge, the dietary mainstays, became scarce commodities. Desperate measures, late planting and crop switching. Yet peasants were not passive victims of nature's cruelty. They employed various strategies to salvage what they could from the earth and delay the inevitable hunger. One such strategy was late planting, an act of hopeful resilience. When the first round of sowing failed, some peasants risked planting a second crop later in the season, often in the hope that the rains might return. This decision was fraught with uncertainty. Late planting reduced the growing season, leaving crops vulnerable to early frost or insufficient maturation time. Still, it was a gamble worth taking, a desperate attempt to coax life from the barren soil before winter sealed the fate of the fields. Late planting was not a universal practice but depended heavily on the region, soil type, and local climate. In some parts of medieval Europe, a second planting was a known agricultural tactic during poor seasons, especially for fast-maturing grains like barley or oats. Peasants timed their sowing carefully, hoping to catch a window of moisture from autumn rains or the late summer dew. Some villages organized communal efforts to prepare fields and share seed for late planting, reflecting the communal spirit that drought often demanded. This cooperation was essential. Seed was precious, and wasting it on a doomed crop could spell disaster. Alongside late planting, peasants experimented with crop switching, altering their usual grain crops for varieties better suited to dry conditions or faster growth. This adaptation was a mark of agricultural ingenuity born from necessity. While wheat was prized for its bread-making qualities, it was more sensitive to drought than hardy grains like rye or millet. Rye, in particular, was a staple in poorer soils and drier climates, able to survive with less water and a shorter growing season. Millet and barley also offered more resilience against drought, though their yields and nutritional values varied. In some drought-stricken areas, peasants abandoned wheat fields in favor of these hardier alternatives, even if it meant sacrificing the quality or quantity of their harvest. Switching crops was not without risks or costs. Seed for alternative grains was not always readily available, and traditional farming knowledge favored established planting patterns. Changing crops could upset soil fertility cycles and required adjustments in processing and storage. Moreover, the taste and texture of different grains influenced their marketability and suitability for everyday consumption. Nonetheless, the dire circumstances of drought forced peasants to weigh these drawbacks against the urgent need to avoid complete crop failure. Fallowing and economic hardship. In addition to late planting and crop switching, peasants sometimes resorted to fallowing, leaving fields unplanted to conserve soil moisture and fertility for the following season. While fallowing was a common practice in medieval agriculture, drought years made it more of a forced choice than a strategic rotation. Fields that remained fallow yielded no food at all, compounding the scarcity of available grain and fodder. This created a vicious cycle. With less land in production, less food was harvested, and yet peasants were compelled to leave some fields bare in hopes of preserving future yields. The effects of these agricultural adaptations were visible in the stark emptiness of barns and granaries come harvest time. Storerooms that once overflowed with sheaves of grain stood alarmingly bare. Peasants rationed what little remained with grim precision, aware that the reserves might not last the winter. The social and economic consequences were severe. Grain was a form of currency and a symbol of wealth. Empty barns reflected not only hunger but also vulnerability to debt, eviction, or dependence on charity. The specter of famine loomed large, threatening to unravel the fragile fabric of peasant communities. Market dynamics further complicated survival. During droughts, local markets were flooded with desperate sellers and hungry buyers, driving grain prices up and access down. Wealthier landowners and merchants could exploit scarcity, hoarding grain or exporting it for profit, while peasants found themselves priced out of essential food supplies. This economic pressure was a hidden form of drought's cruelty, as natural failure merged with social inequality to deepen suffering. Alternative food sources and communal support. Despite the bleakness of failed harvests, some peasants sought opportunities in alternative food sources. Foraging for wild plants, nuts, berries, and roots became more common, supplementing dwindling grain supplies. Some communities hunted small game or fished in rivers and ponds, though these resources were also vulnerable to drought's effects. Gardens were planted with drought-resistant vegetables and herbs, a small but vital hedge against hunger. These adaptations highlight the diverse strategies medieval peasants used to stretch limited resources in the face of environmental hardship. The communal nature of medieval village life played a crucial role in managing the crisis of the hollow harvest. Shared labor, collective storage, and reciprocal aid helped mitigate the worst effects of crop failure. Peasant families pooled their resources, shared seeds for late planting, and distributed food according to need. Church charities and monastic institutions sometimes provided grain or alms, recognizing the severity of drought-induced famine. These social supports, while imperfect, underscored the interdependence of medieval communities during times of hardship. Agricultural knowledge passed down through generations also influenced how peasants responded to drought. Folk wisdom about planting times, soil preparation, and water conservation shaped decisions on when and how to sow late crops or switch grains. While scientific understanding was limited, empirical observation and tradition guided the careful management of increasingly unreliable land. Peasants learned to read subtle environmental cues, the color of the soil, the behavior of plants and animals, to predict the viability of planting or the need to change crops. The emotional toll of the hollow harvest was profound. Farmers faced the constant fear of losing their livelihood and their families to starvation. The labor-intensive nature of late planting and crop switching added physical exhaustion to psychological stress. Yet the act of continuing to work the land, despite poor odds, reflected a stubborn hope and attachment to place. To abandon the fields entirely meant losing not only food but also identity and community ties. The hollow harvest was a test of endurance, adaptability, and communal resilience. Late planting and crop switching were not guarantees of success, but they represented vital strategies for survival in a world where nature's generosity could not be taken for granted. Medieval peasants, caught between the demands of the earth and the pressures of society, faced drought with a combination of pragmatism, ingenuity, and sheer will. Their stories of empty barns and cracked fields reveal not only the fragility of medieval agrarian life but also the persistent human drive to endure through hardship. Milk without rain, livestock during drought. The role of livestock in medieval peasant life was critical and deeply intertwined with survival, especially during times of deadly drought. In a society where agricultural success determined the livelihood of families, the well-being of animals was just as vital as the health of the crops. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and poultry were essential not only for providing food, such as milk, meat, and eggs, but also for labor, manure to fertilize fields, and even social status. Yet droughts wrought devastation on these animals just as severely as on the crops, forcing peasants into agonizing decisions as their milk supplies dwindled and animals weakened from hunger and thirst. The drying up of a lifeline. Milk was a cornerstone of the peasant diet, fresh, rich in nutrients, and versatile. It was consumed directly, churned into butter, or transformed into cheese, providing vital sustenance through lean times. However, droughts severely disrupted this lifeline. With parched pastures and depleted water sources, cows and goats suffered from insufficient grazing and drinking water, which directly affected their milk production. As the dry months dragged on, the volume and quality of milk dropped dramatically, leaving families without a staple they had relied upon for generations. The drying up of milk was a slow, heartbreaking process. Early in the drought, the animals might still produce some milk, though less than usual and often of poorer quality. The fat content dropped, making butter and cheese harder to produce or less flavorful. As the earth hardened and grasses turned brittle, grazing became inadequate. Cows and goats, weakened by thirst and starvation, simply could not sustain their lactation. For many peasants, this signaled the beginning of a deeper crisis. Milk was often one of the first resources to run low, and with its loss came the immediate threat of malnutrition, especially for children and the elderly. Compounding the challenge was the dwindling water supply. Wells, streams, and ponds that once nourished animals ran dry or shrank to mere puddles. Peasants scrambled to find alternative water sources, traveling longer distances to wells, collecting rainwater in barrels when possible, or leading animals to distant rivers. These journeys demanded time and energy, often taking villagers away from other crucial tasks like tending fields or preparing food. Yet without water, the livestock could not survive, and their weakening condition became a visible symbol of the drought's relentless pressure. Agonizing choices and animal decline. The physical decline of animals was evident. Once robust cows grew gaunt, their ribs protruding beneath stretched skin. Goats and sheep, typically hardy creatures, became frail and sluggish. Horses and oxen, the indispensable work animals for plowing and transportation, suffered exhaustion and illness, threatening the very labor that supported the agricultural cycle. The loss of strength in draft animals was particularly devastating, as it limited peasants' ability to till land, harvest what little crops remained, or transport goods and water. As animals weakened, peasants faced difficult survival choices. Many were forced to cull their herds, selling or slaughtering livestock to conserve scarce feed and water for the remaining animals or to raise cash for food purchases. This decision was agonizing. Livestock represented both immediate sustenance and future security. Selling animals could provide temporary relief but risked impoverishing families in the long term. Slaughtering offered a last source of meat but meant reducing the herd's size and breeding potential, making recovery after the drought more difficult. In some villages, communal agreements or local lord interventions influenced how livestock were managed during drought. There were cases where peasants pooled resources or coordinated grazing to stretch feed supplies, though this cooperation was sometimes limited by social tensions and individual desperation. Lords might enforce quotas or restrictions on the number of animals peasants could keep alive during famine, prioritizing grain production or taxation. Such controls added a layer of political complexity to the already dire economic and environmental crisis. The relationship between peasants and their animals during drought was not only economic but also emotional and spiritual. Livestock were companions and vital parts of family life. The sight of suffering animals caused grief and a sense of helplessness. Peasants often turned to prayers or rituals, hoping for divine intervention to ease the animals' suffering or restore rain. The loss of a beloved cow or a prized horse was mourned deeply, symbolizing the broader destruction the drought wrought upon the community. Mitigating efforts and long-term adaptations. Efforts to mitigate the drought's effects on livestock included feeding animals alternative fodder when traditional grazing failed. Peasants gathered whatever they could, dry straw, leaves, rushes, or even weeds, to supplement diets. This fodder was of low nutritional value but better than nothing, helping to keep animals alive through the harshest months. Some families rationed fodder carefully, prioritizing pregnant or milking animals. In extreme cases, animals were kept in closer quarters to conserve feed and protect them from the scorching sun. Goats and sheep, being more drought-tolerant, sometimes became a more favored livestock during dry spells. Their smaller size and hardiness allowed them to survive on sparse vegetation, making them a more reliable source of milk and meat. Peasants increasingly relied on these animals when cattle herds diminished. Chickens and other poultry also played an important role, providing eggs and occasional meat, though drought affected them less directly. Despite these adaptive measures, many peasant families faced the stark reality of losing their herds. The death of livestock from starvation, dehydration, or disease during drought was common. Carcasses sometimes littered fields or were buried in shallow graves, a grim reminder of nature's cruelty. The loss of animals affected every aspect of peasant life, reducing food availability, limiting labor capacity, and diminishing manure supplies needed to fertilize fields for future crops. Moreover, the livestock crisis influenced peasant social relations. Families with larger herds or better access to water might survive better, but envy and competition sometimes fractured communities. Those with few or no animals suffered disproportionately, becoming reliant on neighbors or charity. The scarcity of livestock also affected market dynamics. Prices fluctuated wildly, with some animals fetching high sums while others were sold off cheaply in desperation. This economic instability compounded the human toll of the drought. In response to these challenges, some peasants diversified their livestock or shifted their breeding practices. Selecting animals better suited to dry conditions became a survival tactic. Over time, regional breeds adapted to drought-prone areas, developing traits like smaller size, hardier hooves, or more efficient water use. Though such adaptations took generations, they were part of the long-term strategy peasants employed to cope with climatic variability. Medieval texts and chronicles occasionally reference these struggles with livestock during drought, offering glimpses into the daily reality faced by peasants. Laws and ordinances sometimes addressed animal care during famines, setting rules for grazing rights or penalties for neglect. Church sermons lamented the suffering of creatures under God's judgment but also encouraged compassion and communal support. Together, these sources highlight how the well-being of animals was inseparable from the well-being of the community. Ultimately, the story of milk without rain reflects a broader narrative of resilience amid hardship. Peasants, bound to the land and their animals, endured drought through a mixture of resourcefulness, faith, and painful sacrifice. The drying of milk and weakening of livestock was not merely an agricultural loss but a profound human crisis that shaped medieval rural life in drought-stricken years. The legacy of these experiences influenced agricultural practices, social structures, and cultural memory, reminding later generations of the delicate balance between nature and survival. Dust and duty. How medieval peasants survived deadly droughts. In the relentless grip of drought, a medieval peasant's life became an unforgiving balance between survival and duty. The earth beneath their feet cracked and dried, fields became a patchwork of dust and withered stubble. Yet, despite failing harvests and dwindling resources, the demands of labor intensified rather than waned. The very nature of peasant labor, so tightly bound to the land's cycles, meant that drought offered no respite but instead deepened the burden. Toiling under a burning sky, with parched hands and cracked lips, defined the everyday reality for medieval peasants who had to meet their obligations even as the world around them withered. The paradox of intensified labor. Peasant labor was, at its core, a symbiotic relationship with the land and its governing social hierarchy. Their work wasn't just about personal survival, it was also a response to feudal obligations, communal expectations, and the cyclical rhythms of medieval agriculture. During drought, these responsibilities didn't diminish. Lords demanded tithes and rents, the church required tithe crops, and village communities depended on collective efforts to maintain what little life remained. Thus, peasants found themselves trapped in a paradox. To sustain themselves, they needed to work the land, but the land itself was failing. From dawn until dusk, peasants labored under skies so empty and blue they seemed to mock their hardship. Tasks that once promised bounty, tilling, sowing, tending, now became exercises in futility and endurance. Fields that should have been lush with green instead yielded brittle stalks and dust clouds. Each seed planted risked the cruel possibility of never sprouting. Still, peasants worked tirelessly, compelled by necessity and by the harsh reality that failure to fulfill their duties could mean eviction, punishment, or worse. The physical demands of drought labor were staggering. The sun scorched without mercy, drying sweat and leaving skins cracked and burnt. Water for drinking was rationed tightly, and breaks for refreshment were brief or non-existent. Hands became raw from handling dry soil and tools, backs bent under the weight of baskets, plows, and sacks. The exhaustion was not only physical but mental and emotional. Hope was a scarce commodity when every day seemed to repeat the same relentless cycle of struggle. One of the most taxing aspects of labor during drought was the necessity of watering and caring for the fields with limited resources. Peasants would try to conserve precious water for crops, often drawing from wells, rain barrels, or distant streams, then carrying heavy buckets by hand or with the help of animals. The act of irrigation was painstaking, with the water barely reaching parched roots before evaporating under the hot sun. These small efforts, though often seemingly futile, were acts of hope and defiance against the harsh conditions. Broader labor shifts and diminished returns. Labor in the fields was often supplemented by additional work around the village aimed at maximizing whatever resources remained. Peasants repaired ditches, maintained wells, and constructed rudimentary water collection systems from thatch and wood. These tasks required skill and coordination, and often entire families and neighbors pitched in to improve their chances of survival. Communal labor became a necessary strategy for drought resilience, as shared efforts conserved time and energy in a period when both were in short supply. Yet, while labor intensified, the returns diminished. The rewards of peasant toil, grain for bread, vegetables, hay for animals, shrank to almost nothing. This economic reality meant that peasants worked harder for less sustenance, creating a vicious cycle of exhaustion and deprivation. Hunger and fatigue weakened the workforce, yet they had no choice but to persist. To quit was to face starvation or eviction. Thus, the notion of duty, both to the land and to their social roles, became a driving force that kept peasants working despite near hopelessness. Labor demands during drought also shifted seasonally in ways that forced peasants to adapt. Spring, normally a time of planting and hopeful beginnings, became a period of anxious monitoring. Seeds had to be sown early to capture any moisture, requiring swift and intense bursts of labor before the soil turned too dry. Summer work centered around attempting to preserve what little could be saved, hoeing weeds to reduce competition for scarce water, constructing shade shelters for vulnerable plants, or salvaging withered crops for fodder. Autumn, which usually heralded the harvest, was instead a season of dread and desperation. The scant crops that did survive were gathered hastily, often before full ripeness, to prevent total loss. Harvesting labor was frenzied and exhausting, with peasants racing against the threat of complete crop failure. This labor was also tinged with sorrow, as the yield was insufficient to sustain through the coming winter, foreshadowing further hardship. Economic pressure and communal resilience. Beyond the fields, drought affected labor in village workshops and common areas. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and other tradesmen found their work curtailed by the scarcity of resources and customers. Peasants might supplement their income or barter goods to acquire food or water. However, with the general economy in decline, opportunities were limited, and many turned to subsistence strategies that required yet more manual labor, such as foraging wild plants or gathering firewood from increasingly bare forests. The communal obligations of peasants didn't lessen during drought. If anything, they became more demanding. Villages often required shared labor on infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and drainage systems to protect arable land from erosion and further degradation. These tasks, while vital for long-term survival, pulled labor away from immediate food production. This delicate balancing act created tensions within communities, as peasants juggled individual survival needs against collective duties. Additionally, peasant labor was deeply affected by the social hierarchy and expectations of the time. Lords and landowners expected the same labor output regardless of environmental conditions, and failure to meet these expectations could result in fines, loss of land rights, or harsh penalties. The feudal system offered little mercy for natural calamities, placing peasants in a vulnerable position where their hard work might still not guarantee security. This pressure exacerbated the physical and psychological toll of drought labor. Women and children were integral to the labor force during drought, often taking on heavier workloads as men were occupied with demanding field work or traveled to distant water sources. Women managed domestic duties such as cooking with scarce ingredients, fetching water, and caring for livestock, all of which required energy and resourcefulness under increasingly difficult circumstances. Children, too, contributed by helping gather firewood, tend small animals, or assist in the fields. The collective labor of the entire household was essential to endure the prolonged hardships. Despite the oppressive conditions, peasant labor during drought was also marked by ingenuity and adaptation. Faced with barren fields, peasants experimented with different planting techniques, such as dry sowing or planting drought-resistant crops like millet and rye. They learned to conserve energy by prioritizing tasks with the highest chance of success and developed systems for rotating work to avoid exhaustion. These strategies, born from necessity, demonstrate the resilience and practical knowledge that helped communities survive. The rhythm of labor was punctuated by moments of despair and resilience. Harvest festivals and communal prayers took on heightened significance, offering spiritual respite and reinforcing social bonds. These gatherings reminded peasants that their labor was part of a larger cycle and that communal effort could stave off total ruin. In some cases, these moments inspired renewed vigor, enabling peasants to push through the most grueling periods. Ultimately, the story of peasant labor during medieval drought is one of endurance against overwhelming odds. The paradox of working harder as resources vanished encapsulates the harsh reality of survival in a pre-industrial agrarian world. Labor was not merely physical exertion but a manifestation of hope, duty, and an unyielding will to live. It shaped not only the immediate fate of families but also the social and environmental landscape of medieval Europe. Through sweat, dust, and determination, peasants sustained themselves and their communities. Their labor during drought was a testament to human tenacity, reflecting a complex interplay of social structure, environmental challenge, and cultural resilience. Though the earth was thirsty and the skies silent, the hands of peasants never ceased to work, embodying a timeless struggle to carve life from the harshest of conditions. Gathered beneath the bell tower, the role of the church and community leadership during times of crisis. In the medieval world, the church was not only a place of worship but the very heart of village life, especially in times of crisis such as deadly droughts. Peasant communities gathered beneath the towering bell towers, where the ringing of the bells summoned them not just to prayers but to collective endurance and social order. As drought ravaged fields and drained wells, the church and its leadership played a pivotal role in guiding, consoling, and organizing communities to survive the harshest of seasons. In a world where nature's fury was often seen as a divine test, the church's presence shaped how peasants understood, responded to, and endured the scarcity wrought by drought. The church as a communal hub. The bell tower was more than an architectural landmark. It was a symbol of communal identity and spiritual refuge. When the sky stayed mercilessly clear and the earth cracked open, villagers looked upward toward the church for signs of hope and solace. The daily tolling of the bells called peasants from their work in the fields to gatherings of prayer and communal decision-making. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They reinforced a shared sense of purpose and faith, helped disseminate information about resource management, and coordinated efforts to address the mounting hardships. The church thus acted as a vital communication hub, bridging the gap between the divine and the practical realities of drought survival. At the center of this community leadership stood the parish priest. More than a religious figure, the priest was often the mediator between the Lord and the peasants, the keeper of knowledge, and the moral compass during times when despair threatened to overwhelm. The priest's sermons during drought seasons were tailored to address both spiritual and social concerns. He reminded the faithful that drought was a test of their piety and resilience, urging them to maintain faith and community cohesion even as the fields lay fallow and the livestock weakened. Through his words, he sought to transform suffering into a shared experience of endurance under God's watchful eye. The church's role extended beyond spiritual comfort. In many villages, the clergy were custodians of practical knowledge about agriculture, weather lore, and medicinal plants, passed down through generations. This knowledge proved crucial in advising peasants on how to conserve water, protect crops, and care for animals during drought. The church grounds often housed gardens where herbs and drought-resistant plants were cultivated, serving as both a resource and a living lesson for villagers on sustainable practices. These gardens were a testament to the church's intertwined spiritual and practical missions. Shared responsibilities and resource management. Community leadership during drought was not limited to the church alone but included village elders, bailiffs, and other appointed officials who worked alongside the priest. These leaders were responsible for organizing labor, managing scarce resources, and ensuring that social obligations such as tithes and rents were met to the best of the community's ability. Their leadership was critical in preventing social unrest, which drought conditions could easily provoke. Through councils and meetings held in or near the church, these leaders negotiated priorities, settled disputes, and planned collective responses to the crisis. The church also played a direct role in resource management. During drought, villagers faced the difficult task of rationing water, food, and fuel. The church often became the center for the distribution of alms and relief. Wealthier parishes and monasteries sometimes shared grain reserves or water sources with the local population. Monastic institutions, with their extensive landholdings and relative wealth, could provide essential support in ways smaller village communities could not. This support was crucial in preventing total collapse during prolonged dry spells. Rituals and ceremonies conducted by the church were more than acts of faith. They were communal strategies to cope with drought. Processions through fields and villages, prayers for rain, and the invocation of specific saints associated with weather or agriculture were common. These rituals served multiple functions. They maintained communal morale, reinforced social bonds, and provided a framework for collective action. They also helped peasants feel that they were participating in a larger cosmic order, where human effort and divine will intertwined. Psychological impact and long-term resilience. The psychological impact of the church's leadership during drought cannot be overstated. In a time when scientific understanding of weather was limited, and natural disasters were often interpreted as punishments or tests from God, faith was a critical source of comfort. The church's promise of eventual divine mercy offered peasants a future beyond the immediate suffering. This hope was a vital psychological lifeline, sustaining communities when physical resources ran dangerously low. Education and oral tradition were other vital aspects of the church's influence. Priests often taught children and adults alike about agricultural cycles, religious calendars, and moral lessons that included guidance on humility and perseverance. These teachings helped peasants frame their experiences within a larger narrative of human existence, endurance, and redemption. Stories of saints who had overcome hardship or brought rain through prayer became part of the cultural fabric, shaping how drought was perceived and endured across generations. Community gatherings at the church also facilitated social cohesion. Drought conditions tested the limits of neighborly generosity and cooperation. The church's emphasis on charity and communal responsibility encouraged peasants to share scarce resources, assist the weakest members, and maintain social order. These gatherings reinforced the idea that survival was not just an individual challenge but a collective one, where every person's well-being was intertwined with that of their neighbors. Moreover, the church often acted as a mediator in conflicts exacerbated by drought scarcity. Disputes over water rights, land usage, and food distribution were common in times of shortage. The moral authority of the priest and church officials helped to arbitrate these disputes, preventing violent clashes that could further destabilize fragile communities. This role was crucial in preserving peace and enabling coordinated survival strategies. The integration of spiritual leadership with practical governance during drought also shaped long-term community resilience. Villages that maintained strong ties to their churches and leaders were often better equipped to organize collective labor, manage resources, and sustain morale. The church's network extended beyond individual villages to regional and monastic centers, providing a broader support system that could mobilize aid and share knowledge. At the same time, the church was not immune to criticism or tension. Some peasants questioned the fairness of tithes and church taxes during times of hardship, especially when the clergy themselves appeared insulated from suffering. These tensions occasionally sparked dissent or passive resistance, revealing the complex dynamics between faith, authority, and survival. Nevertheless, the church's central role in community life generally prevailed, as the benefits of its leadership during drought were too vital to ignore. In conclusion, the church and community leadership were pillars of support during medieval droughts, shaping not only how peasants endured physical scarcity but also how they interpreted and navigated their experiences. Beneath the bell tower, faith, governance, and communal solidarity converged to sustain hope and survival in a harsh and unforgiving environment. Through prayer, practical knowledge, resource management, and social cohesion, the church helped transform the silent skies and cracked fields into a shared journey of endurance, ensuring that even in the direst times, medieval peasants were not alone. Migration and wandering feet. How medieval peasants survived deadly droughts. Drought in the medieval period was a slow, creeping disaster that seeped into every corner of rural life. For many peasants, the gradual disappearance of water and food meant that the land they had lived on and worked for generations became hostile and unlivable. Fields that once promised grain, vegetables, and fodder cracked under the relentless sun. Wells ran dry, and rivers shrank into trickles. Under such harsh conditions, staying put was not always a viable option. Migration became a desperate but necessary strategy for survival, forcing peasants to take to wandering feet in search of better opportunities, water, and sustenance. Migration during medieval droughts was rarely a simple or straightforward decision. It was often a last resort after other survival strategies, rationing water, changing diets, praying for rain, had failed. For peasants deeply tied to their land through feudal obligations, customs, and family history, the choice to leave their village was fraught with uncertainty and fear. Land was identity, security, and livelihood, and abandoning it was to risk losing everything. Yet, when the earth refused to yield crops, and livestock weakened or died, migration became a practical necessity to avoid starvation and death. Patterns of movement and vulnerability. The nature of this migration was diverse, shaped by the social status of the peasants, the severity of the drought, and available networks of support. Some peasants traveled alone or in small family groups, carrying what little possessions they could. Others joined larger caravans or pilgrim-like groups, often moving toward towns, monasteries, or regions where reports of rain or food supplies circulated. These movements were not aimless wanderings but calculated journeys dictated by knowledge passed through oral traditions, rumors, and the advice of local leaders or clergy. One of the most common forms of migration was seasonal labor migration. As local fields failed, peasants sought work in more fertile regions or on the lands of wealthier lords less affected by drought. They became itinerant workers, performing agricultural labor, tending livestock, or working in the emerging crafts and markets of towns. This form of migration was precarious, as peasants often traveled with no guarantees of employment or shelter. Yet, it provided a crucial alternative to starvation, allowing them to exchange labor for food or coin. Seasonal migration could also strengthen social ties across regions, as families sent members away temporarily, hoping to return once the drought eased. In some cases, entire villages or hamlets abandoned their homes in search of new lands. This mass migration was rare and traumatic but did occur when droughts were prolonged and catastrophic. Villagers faced difficult journeys through unfamiliar terrain, often encountering natural barriers, hostile communities, or political borders. The medieval landscape was not a blank slate. It was controlled by lords, kingdoms, and city-states that regulated movement and settlement. Refugees from drought faced the challenge of negotiating their place in new territories, sometimes through tenancy, purchase, or by offering labor or military service. These migrations reshaped demographic patterns and sometimes altered local economies and politics. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable during migrations. The journey was exhausting and dangerous, with scarce food and water increasing the risks of illness and death. Communities tried to protect their most vulnerable, but the harsh reality was that many perished along the way. The loss of family members added to the trauma and uncertainty of migration, and returning home was often impossible. Stories of wandering peasants echo through medieval chronicles and folklore, depicting a restless humanity driven by the elemental need to survive. In addition to seeking better lands or work, some peasants moved toward religious centers or pilgrimage sites during droughts. Monasteries and churches often maintained better reserves of food and water, as well as access to charity. Pilgrimage was both a spiritual and practical response to drought. Faith offered hope and community support, while the journey itself opened access to aid or employment. Pilgrimage routes became corridors of movement for displaced peasants, blending religious devotion with survival strategy. Social, economic, and political impacts. The social consequences of migration were profound. Migrating peasants faced discrimination and suspicion in new communities, often viewed as poor, desperate outsiders. They competed with local laborers for scarce jobs and resources, leading to tensions and sometimes violent confrontations. Migration disrupted traditional social structures, weakening family and village ties. However, it also created new networks of kinship and cooperation across regions. Migrants shared stories, skills, and resources, contributing to the gradual transformation of medieval society. Migration also affected land management and agricultural practices in both abandoned and receiving areas. When peasants left drought-stricken lands, fields lay fallow or were taken over by lords or wealthier tenants. This sometimes led to changes in land use, such as converting arable land to pasture, which required less water. In receiving areas, the influx of migrant labor could increase agricultural productivity but also strain local resources. Lords and local authorities had to balance these dynamics, sometimes encouraging migration to maintain economic output, sometimes restricting it to protect their own interests. The church often played a dual role in migration during droughts. On one hand, it provided aid and refuge to wandering peasants, offering food, shelter, and spiritual comfort. On the other, it sometimes discouraged permanent migration by emphasizing the importance of the local community and the dangers of dislocation. Clergy preached patience and faith in divine providence, urging peasants to endure and rebuild rather than abandon their homes. However, in many cases, church institutions became hubs for displaced peasants, managing charity distribution and mediating conflicts in new settlements. Peasant migration also intersected with the political realities of medieval Europe. Borders between kingdoms, principalities, and lordships were often contested or strictly controlled. Migrants crossing these boundaries had to navigate complex legal and military landscapes. Sometimes, rulers welcomed migrating peasants to repopulate lands devastated by war or plague, offering privileges or reduced obligations. Other times, migrants were treated as suspicious outsiders, facing restrictions, taxes, or expulsion. This patchwork of responses shaped the patterns and outcomes of drought-induced migration. The physical hardships of migration were immense. Traveling on foot with limited provisions, peasants faced exposure to the elements, hunger, thirst, and the threat of bandits or wild animals. Roads were rudimentary, and maps non-existent for most. Migrants relied on local knowledge, landmarks, and the kindness of strangers to navigate. Along the way, they gathered information about weather patterns, crop conditions, and political situations that influenced their next steps. This flow of information contributed to a wider medieval network of knowledge and adaptation. Resilience and transformation. Despite the dangers and difficulties, migration was also a source of resilience and renewal. It allowed peasants to escape the immediate effects of drought, find new resources, and adapt to changing conditions. Migration brought new ideas, techniques, and cultural exchanges that could enrich communities. Over time, these movements contributed to the gradual evolution of medieval society from isolated, self-sufficient villages toward more interconnected regional economies and cultures. Migration during drought was also a deeply emotional experience. Leaving behind home, family, and familiar land was a profound loss. The uncertainty of the journey and the unknown future weighed heavily on peasants' hearts. Yet, migration was also a testament to human determination and hope, a refusal to succumb to despair even when the earth seemed dead and the skies unyielding. Stories of wandering peasants, of footsore families seeking sustenance and shelter, became part of the collective memory and oral tradition, passed down through generations. For those who stayed behind, migration of neighbors and relatives added another layer of hardship. Villages shrank, fields went untended, and social structures frayed. But the ties between those who left and those who remained often persisted through letters, visits, or shared festivals when possible. Migration was not an end but a transformation of community, creating networks that transcended place and hardship. In some cases, migration led to permanent resettlement and the founding of new villages. Migrants who found fertile land or supportive lords established new homes, bringing with them traditions, skills, and hopes. These new settlements sometimes served as refuges during later droughts or crises, embodying the long-term adaptive strategies of medieval peasants. The experience of migration during drought highlights the complex interplay between environment, society, and survival in the medieval period. It reveals peasants not as passive victims but as active agents navigating a harsh and unpredictable world. Through movement and adaptation, they sought to preserve life and community in the face of relentless dryness. Stories by a Dry Hearth: How Medieval Peasants Coped Emotionally with Disaster. In the midst of the relentless drought that withered fields and drained wells, when the sun blazed mercilessly overhead and the earth cracked beneath the feet of medieval peasants, the humble hearth became more than just a place to cook or warm the body. It was the heart of the home, the sanctuary where people gathered to seek comfort, to share news, and to weave stories that sustained their spirits when the land and sky offered no relief. Storytelling, folklore, and songs were vital lifelines, tools of emotional survival that helped peasants endure the despair and uncertainty brought on by dead seasons and empty granaries. The medieval peasants' world was one where oral tradition formed the backbone of cultural life. With limited literacy and scarce access to written texts, tales passed from mouth to ear were the primary way knowledge, history, and values were preserved and transmitted. These stories, often shared by elders, village storytellers, or traveling minstrels, created a rich tapestry of meaning that intertwined the sacred and the mundane, the real and the supernatural. In times of drought, when the natural world betrayed its bounty, stories became a refuge where hope could take root and where communal identity was reaffirmed. The power of narrative and emotional release. Around the fire, families and neighbors gathered as daylight faded, drawn together by a shared need to make sense of their suffering. The drought was not merely a physical event but a spiritual trial. Stories recounted past hardships and victories, reminding listeners that their ancestors had also faced adversity and emerged resilient. Tales of previous droughts, floods, famines, and plagues served to normalize suffering as part of the human condition, placing the current crisis within a larger historical and cosmic framework. This perspective helped diminish feelings of isolation and despair, providing a kind of moral ballast in an uncertain time. Folklore told of heroes and spirits who controlled the weather and the earth's fertility. Peasants believed in the intervention of supernatural forces, both benevolent and wrathful, that could bring rain or prolong drought. Stories of saints who answered prayers, of mysterious figures who danced with the winds, or of ancient creatures that guarded hidden springs were not just fanciful tales but deeply embedded expressions of hope and faith. These narratives fostered a sense of connection to the natural and divine world, suggesting that the drought might be ended through ritual, prayer, or moral renewal. Songs, too, played a powerful role by lifting the spirit and binding communities. Sung around the hearth or during communal work, drought-related ballads and laments expressed grief and longing, but also resilience and determination. The rhythms and melodies offered a collective catharsis, allowing individuals to share their sorrow and find comfort in the voices of others. Some songs invoked rain or celebrated past harvests, while others warned of the consequences of neglecting the land or divine laws. Music helped to regulate emotions, turning anxiety and fear into shared strength. Teaching, coping, and cultural continuity. The art of storytelling during drought was not only about recounting facts or legends but also about teaching lessons and reinforcing social norms. Stories warned against selfishness, greed, and moral decay, which were often blamed for divine punishment in the form of drought. Through tales of misfortune brought upon by sin, peasants were reminded of the importance of community cohesion, generosity, and piety. Conversely, stories extolled virtues like perseverance, humility, and hard work, encouraging listeners to endure hardships with patience and faith. The narrative structure of drought stories often followed a pattern of struggle, intervention, and renewal. Peasants would hear of a hero or saint who encountered hardship, embarked on a quest or trial, and ultimately secured relief for the community, usually through prayer, sacrifice, or courage. These cyclical stories mirrored the seasonal cycles of medieval agrarian life and reinforced the hope that the drought too would end. The idea that after suffering comes regeneration was a powerful psychological anchor in the face of the drying earth. Women were frequently the primary storytellers in medieval households, and their role in passing on folklore and songs was central to emotional survival. By sharing stories, women nurtured not only their families' bodies but their souls. They preserved ancient narratives that shaped identity and memory, adapting them to the immediate crisis of drought. Through lullabies, tales of trickster animals, or accounts of divine mercy, women helped children understand the world's harshness while instilling resilience and hope. The hearth stories were thus a form of informal education, blending practical wisdom with cultural continuity. Storytelling also provided a means to process the social and psychological impact of drought. The uncertainty of failing crops and vanishing water supplies bred fear, suspicion, and sometimes despair. Stories offered ways to express these emotions safely, transforming personal anxiety into shared narrative. In this way, storytelling was a communal therapy, fostering empathy and mutual support. It also allowed peasants to critique local leaders or question divine justice obliquely, encoding social commentary in allegory or metaphor. The drought within: mental health, grief, and quiet despair. The relentless sun beating down on barren fields was only part of the hardship medieval peasants faced during a drought. Beyond the cracked earth and empty granaries, there was another, less visible drought, a drought of the spirit, a deep, pervasive strain on mental health. The psychological burden of watching the land wither, streams dry, and once promising seeds fail to sprout brought a quiet, gnawing despair that seeped into every corner of peasant life. This internal drought often went unnoticed by chroniclers and historians, yet it shaped how peasants endured, responded to, and survived the harshest seasons. Medieval peasants lived intimately connected to the cycles of nature, relying heavily on the earth's rhythms to sustain life. When drought disrupted these rhythms, it did more than threaten food and water supplies. It shattered the fundamental sense of order and stability on which their existence depended. The anxiety born from uncertainty about the future gnawed away at hope. The predictability of planting, growth, harvest, and rest, the familiar cycles that structured days and years, were broken, replaced by a relentless tension marked by watching and waiting. This prolonged uncertainty bred a deep psychological fatigue, an invisible weight that pressed on bodies already weakened by hunger and thirst. Grief and emotional burden. Grief was a common companion during drought. Peasants mourned not only the loss of crops and livestock but also the loss of normalcy and security. Each failed seed represented dashed hopes, each dry well a broken promise of sustenance. These losses were often compounded by the deaths of loved ones, weakened by hunger or disease exacerbated by drought conditions. The boundaries between physical and emotional suffering blurred as communities experienced collective trauma. Families shared in the sorrow of neighbors, and the cumulative grief permeated village life, dampening celebrations, silencing songs, and casting shadows over even the smallest joys. Mental health, as we understand it today, was not a concept medieval peasants would have recognized, yet they certainly experienced symptoms that align with depression, anxiety, and despair. The constant stress of survival under drought conditions led to exhaustion, irritability, and withdrawal. The psychological toll was evident in the stories that survived. Tales of madness, loss of reason, and despair were interwoven with accounts of famine and hardship. Without formal support systems or knowledge of mental health care, peasants relied on community, faith, and ritual as the main means of coping. Faith played a complex role in managing the emotional drought. For many peasants, the experience of drought was interpreted through a religious lens. Suffering was seen as a test from God or a punishment for sin. This belief could both comfort and torment. On one hand, it offered meaning amid chaos, suffering had purpose, and perseverance promised divine reward. On the other, it could foster feelings of guilt and helplessness. Those who believed they or their community had sinned enough to bring down God's wrath sometimes fell into despair or isolation, feeling unworthy of mercy. Yet, even in such darkness, religious practices provided rituals through which emotional pain could be expressed and released, offering moments of solace. Communal support and psychological resilience. Communal life was a critical buffer against the drought within. Peasants depended on family and neighbors not only for physical survival but also for emotional support. Shared labor, food, and stories fostered a sense of solidarity, reminding individuals that they were part of a larger whole. Mutual aid networks, though strained by scarcity, functioned to some extent to share burdens and lighten emotional loads. The simple acts of gathering around the hearth, sharing a meal, or lending a listening ear helped to mitigate feelings of isolation. Even fleeting moments of laughter or kindness could rekindle hope and resilience. However, not all peasants weathered this emotional strain equally. Vulnerable individuals, such as the elderly, the very young, or those already weakened by illness, were at heightened risk of succumbing to despair. Women, burdened by care duties and the pressure to maintain household stability, often bore a disproportionate emotional load. The psychological effects of drought could manifest in physical symptoms: fatigue, insomnia, loss of appetite, and worsening health. In some cases, despair led to desperate acts, including abandonment, theft, or even self-harm, though such events were rarely recorded. The silence surrounding mental suffering was reinforced by cultural norms that prized endurance and silence. To complain openly was often seen as a sign of weakness or moral failing. Peasants were expected to bear their hardships quietly, trusting in divine justice and their own fortitude. This stoicism, while a survival mechanism, could also deepen emotional isolation. The inner drought was a private battle, waged away from the eyes of others, adding layers of loneliness to the suffering. Rituals and communal events offered rare but vital outlets for expressing grief and anxiety. Religious ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and collective prayers were moments when pent-up emotions found a socially accepted release. Singing, dancing, and lamentation allowed peasants to voice their fears and hopes publicly, creating a shared emotional space that strengthened bonds and eased psychological burdens. These gatherings reinforced the belief that no one was alone in their struggle, reinforcing the communal identity that was essential for endurance. Storytelling, as explored in previous segments, also served as a key tool in managing the drought within. Through narratives of survival, divine intervention, and renewal, peasants could envision a future beyond their immediate despair. The stories offered frameworks to understand suffering and encouraged hope, providing mental scaffolding to bear the emotional strain. Likewise, songs and prayers functioned as emotional anchors, guiding feelings through grief and uncertainty toward resilience. Lasting impacts and human tenacity. The relentless passage of time during drought years exacerbated mental strain. Unlike short-term crises, which might allow for quick recovery, prolonged droughts stretched hope thin and tested endurance to its limits. The cumulative effect was chronic stress, which weakened bodies and minds alike. Peasants who had survived one drought knew the possibility of another could lurk in every dry season, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety that shaped decisions and relationships. Yet, amid this psychological drought, moments of human resilience shone through. Small acts of kindness, humor, and creativity punctuated the hardship. Peasants found ways to care for one another emotionally, sharing food and warmth when physical resources were scarce. Children's laughter, songs sung softly by candlelight, and the occasional festival offered brief respites. These fragments of normalcy helped stave off despair and affirmed life's persistence even in the harshest conditions. The role of community leaders and clergy was also crucial in addressing the emotional needs of drought-stricken peasants. Priests, monks, and elders offered counsel, comfort, and rituals that helped channel anxiety and grief into collective action and faith. Their presence lent a stabilizing influence, providing moral guidance and encouraging communal support. This leadership was often instrumental in organizing relief efforts, distributing resources, and maintaining hope, thus indirectly alleviating emotional suffering. Medical remedies for mental distress in medieval times were rudimentary and often intertwined with superstition. Herbal remedies, charms, and religious rites were employed to ease symptoms of what might now be understood as depression or anxiety. While lacking scientific basis, these practices reflected an attempt to treat the whole person, body and soul, and offered psychological comfort through ritual and attention. The emotional drought had lasting effects on medieval peasant communities. The scars of prolonged mental suffering influenced social dynamics, sometimes deepening mistrust or fueling conflict, but also often reinforcing communal bonds through shared adversity. Oral traditions preserved memories of emotional hardship, embedding the lessons learned into folklore and cultural identity. These stories and practices helped subsequent generations anticipate and cope with the mental challenges droughts brought. In this way, the drought within, the silent, invisible struggle against despair, was as real and as threatening as the physical drought outside. Medieval peasants lived in a precarious balance between hope and hopelessness, their mental resilience tested as severely as their bodies. Understanding this inner drought illuminates the full scope of hardship they endured and the remarkable strength they summoned to survive. Desperate survival and lasting legacy. Yet, even amid such calamity, peasants didn't surrender easily. Their survival strategies became more desperate and inventive. When grain failed, many turned to foraging for wild roots, nuts, and berries, knowledge of which was passed down through generations but rarely enough to sustain entire communities. Others resorted to hunting small game or fishing where possible, though these resources were often insufficient. Trade sometimes provided limited relief, as merchants brought grain from less affected areas, but this was contingent on political stability and market access. Some peasants sought refuge beyond their villages. Migration, both seasonal and permanent, became a survival strategy for those with the means or the strength to leave. Traveling to towns, monasteries, or wealthier estates in search of work, food, or charity, these wandering peasants embodied the human toll of drought-induced catastrophe. However, such movement was fraught with peril. Travel was difficult and dangerous, and newcomers were often met with suspicion or hostility. Medical responses to famine and drought-related illness were rudimentary. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, and religious rites were common treatments but offered little real protection against the ravages of starvation and disease. The lack of effective medical care meant that once illness took hold in malnourished individuals, mortality rates soared. The sheer scale of death during catastrophic droughts overwhelmed local capacities for care and burial. The cultural memory of these disasters was preserved through oral traditions and, occasionally, in written chronicles. Songs, stories, and local legends remembered the times when bones lay in the fields and the earth drank no rain. These narratives served as warnings and lessons, reminding future generations of the precariousness of life and the ever-present threat of nature's fury. They also shaped community identity, fostering resilience through remembrance and shared experience. Despite the overwhelming tragedy, these catastrophes occasionally led to broader social changes. Labor shortages sometimes empowered surviving peasants to negotiate better terms with their lords or move to more favorable regions. In some areas, famine-induced mortality weakened rigid feudal structures, opening paths for economic and social mobility. However, these shifts were uneven and often took decades to manifest, offering only small consolation amid the immediate devastation. The bones left in the fields were silent witnesses to the harsh reality of drought-turned catastrophe. They told of lives ended prematurely, of families shattered, and of communities struggling to hold together amid relentless adversity. Each skeleton was a testament to the vulnerability of medieval peasants and the unforgiving power of nature. The legacy of these tragedies underscored the fragile balance between survival and collapse in a world where a season without rain could mean the difference between life and death. Bones in the field, when droughts turned catastrophic. Drought in medieval times was not merely a season of hardship, it could swiftly transform into a season of death. What began as parched earth and withered crops sometimes spiraled into full-blown catastrophe, leaving behind a landscape haunted by tragedy and bones scattered in the fields. When rain failed for months or even years, the resulting famine could overwhelm the already fragile peasant communities, breaking their capacity to survive and fundamentally altering the social fabric of the village. The journey from drought to disaster was brutal and often merciless, with consequences that echoed for generations. The connection between drought and famine was direct and immediate. Crops, the lifeblood of peasant sustenance, were the first casualties. In years when rains failed, fields cracked under the scorching sun, grain failed to ripen, and root vegetables shriveled. Food reserves, often meager even in good years, were quickly depleted. Peasants depended heavily on their harvests not only for immediate consumption but also for seed to sow the following year. Without a reliable harvest, the cycle of planting itself was threatened, setting in motion a cascade of shortages that could last well beyond the initial drought period. The spread of hunger and disease. As food stocks dwindled, hunger spread through villages like a shadow. Initially, families would ration their remaining supplies, stretching bread and pottage to fill empty stomachs. Children and the elderly, the most vulnerable, often suffered first and most severely. With weakened bodies came greater susceptibility to disease. Malnutrition lowered immune defenses, allowing common infections such as dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis to claim more victims. These illnesses, usually manageable in times of plenty, turned fatal in famine conditions, compounding the death toll. The psychological toll of starvation was equally devastating. Hunger gnawed not only at bellies but also at hope. Families watched loved ones waste away, powerless to intervene. Mothers faced the torment of seeing their children weaken, and many were forced to make harrowing choices in the desperate hope of saving some. Reports from medieval chronicles and accounts hint at heartbreaking scenes: parents giving up children to charity, the elderly left alone, and neighbors reluctantly turning away those too weak to contribute to the community's survival. This breakdown of social cohesion was one of the many tragic consequences drought-driven famine inflicted. In the most extreme cases, starvation led to death on a massive scale. Entire villages could be decimated by famine, their fields left untended and homes abandoned. The skeletons uncovered in archaeological digs across Europe attest to the grim reality of such catastrophes. Mass graves, hastily dug, tell stories of lives cut short in their prime. Bones found scattered in fields suggest the desperate attempts of those dying to reach water or food sources. The aftermath of these famines was a landscape scarred by loss and silence. Societal challenges and environmental degradation. Medieval society was ill-equipped to handle these calamities. Unlike modern states with organized relief systems, medieval communities relied heavily on local resources and social networks. When those networks were overwhelmed, there was little recourse. Lords and nobles sometimes provided relief in the form of grain or money, but their aid was often insufficient or delayed, and frequently came with expectations of continued labor or service. Church charity offered some help through alms and hospitality, yet the scale of need often outstripped available resources. The tragedy of famine extended beyond immediate mortality. Survivors often faced long-term health consequences, including stunted growth, chronic weakness, and lowered fertility. The population of affected areas could decline significantly, leading to labor shortages that disrupted agricultural production and further weakened local economies. These demographic shifts sometimes altered the balance of power within regions, as depopulated areas became vulnerable to invasion or consolidation by stronger lords. Conflict often flared in the wake of famine. Scarce resources bred resentment and competition. Peasants might resist feudal demands for tithes or labor when they themselves faced starvation, sometimes sparking rebellions or localized violence. Theft of grain or livestock increased as desperation grew, and law enforcement struggled to maintain order in communities fraying at the edges. Such social unrest added another layer of tragedy to already shattered lives. Religious interpretations of these catastrophes often intensified the sense of despair. Many peasants believed famine was divine punishment for communal sins or failures. This belief could foster fatalism, undermining efforts to adapt or seek alternative solutions. At the same time, it galvanized religious leaders to call for penitence, prayer, and processions, attempts to appeal to God's mercy. While these rituals offered spiritual comfort to some, they could not prevent the physical realities of hunger and death. The environmental degradation caused by prolonged drought and famine also left lasting scars. Overused and exhausted fields, stripped of vegetation, became prone to erosion and infertility. In some regions, once fertile lands turned barren for years or decades, forcing peasants to abandon traditional plots and seek survival elsewhere. This environmental decline compounded the tragedy, limiting future food production and deepening poverty. Desperate survival and lasting legacy. Yet, even amid such calamity, peasants did not surrender easily. Their survival strategies became more desperate and inventive. When grain failed, many turned to foraging for wild roots, nuts, and berries, knowledge of which was passed down through generations but rarely enough to sustain entire communities. Others resorted to hunting small game or fishing where possible, though these resources were often insufficient. Trade sometimes provided limited relief, as merchants brought grain from less affected areas, but this was contingent on political stability and market access. Some peasants sought refuge beyond their villages. Migration, both seasonal and permanent, became a survival strategy for those with the means or the strength to leave. Traveling to towns, monasteries, or wealthier estates in search of work, food, or charity, these wandering peasants embodied the human toll of drought-induced catastrophe. However, such movement was fraught with peril. Travel was difficult and dangerous, and newcomers were often met with suspicion or hostility. Medical responses to famine and drought-related illness were rudimentary. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, and religious rites were common treatments but offered little real protection against the ravages of starvation and disease. The lack of effective medical care meant that once illness took hold in malnourished individuals, mortality rates soared. The sheer scale of death during catastrophic droughts overwhelmed local capacities for care and burial. The cultural memory of these disasters was preserved through oral traditions and, occasionally, in written chronicles. Songs, stories, and local legends remembered the times when bones lay in the fields and the earth drank no rain. These narratives served as warnings and lessons, reminding future generations of the precariousness of life and the ever-present threat of nature's fury. They also shaped community identity, fostering resilience through remembrance and shared experience. Despite the overwhelming tragedy, these catastrophes occasionally led to broader social changes. Labor shortages sometimes empowered surviving peasants to negotiate better terms with their lords or move to more favorable regions. In some areas, famine-induced mortality weakened rigid feudal structures, opening paths for economic and social mobility. However, these shifts were uneven and often took decades to manifest, offering only small consolation amid the immediate devastation. The bones left in the fields were silent witnesses to the harsh reality of drought-turned catastrophe. They told of lives ended prematurely, of families shattered, and of communities struggling to hold together amid relentless adversity. Each skeleton was a testament to the vulnerability of medieval peasants and the unforgiving power of nature. The legacy of these tragedies underscored the fragile balance between survival and collapse in a world where a season without rain could mean the difference between life and death. Hands in the soil. Peasant innovation and adaptation during droughts. When the skies turned mercilessly dry and the familiar rhythms of rain failed to nourish the fields, medieval peasants found themselves at the crossroads of survival and despair. Yet, amid the harshest droughts, their hands remained firmly rooted in the soil, driven by a fierce determination to adapt and innovate. These communities, often dismissed as powerless and ignorant by the upper classes, developed a variety of practical techniques and shared knowledge that enabled them to eke out a precarious existence even in the driest years. Their innovations were grounded in intimate knowledge of the land, passed down through generations, and sharpened by the pressing necessity of survival. Adapting tools and planting methods. One of the fundamental adaptations involved the very tools peasants used to work the earth. Unlike the heavy plows pulled by oxen that dominated medieval agriculture in fertile regions, peasants in drought-prone areas often relied on lighter, more versatile hand tools that allowed for careful cultivation and moisture retention. The ard plow, while effective in turning heavy soils, could exacerbate dryness by disturbing the protective topsoil layer, allowing precious moisture to escape into the air. In response, peasants developed or favored simpler digging sticks, hoes, and mattocks, which enabled them to till the soil more gently, aerate it without excessive disruption, and break up hardened crusts formed by drought. The careful use of these tools went hand in hand with planting methods designed to maximize water retention and reduce evaporation. Peasants became adept at what modern agronomists would call dry farming techniques. This included shallow planting to take advantage of the small amounts of moisture in the upper soil layers, timing sowing to coincide with the rare early rains or morning dew, and spacing seeds more widely to reduce competition for limited water. These methods were often trial and error processes, refined over decades or centuries, informed by a close reading of weather patterns, soil conditions, and plant behavior. Companion planting was another practice that medieval peasants embraced to combat drought stress. By planting certain crops together, they could create beneficial microenvironments. For example, taller crops like beans or sunflowers were planted alongside shorter, more delicate vegetables to provide shade, reducing soil temperature and evaporation. This simple yet effective form of ecological knowledge demonstrated an early understanding of biodiversity's role in agricultural resilience. The intercropping of legumes also had the added benefit of fixing nitrogen in the soil, helping maintain fertility in difficult conditions. Water and soil conservation techniques. Beyond planting techniques, peasants innovated in the realm of water management. Rainwater harvesting was a crucial skill in dry regions. Many villages featured communal or household cisterns and barrels, often made from wood or clay, to collect whatever rain fell. Even small trickles of water were carefully funneled from roofs, gutters, or natural springs into these storage vessels. This water was reserved for essential uses such as watering seedlings or sustaining the most vulnerable livestock. The design of roofs and drainage systems reflected this priority, often with simple channels or spouts to direct water efficiently into containers. Soil conservation was another area where peasant wisdom shone. Recognizing that soil erosion could be devastating during droughts when protective vegetation died back, peasants employed various methods to preserve the earth. Terracing on hillsides helped slow water runoff and increase absorption, while planting cover crops during fallow periods protected the soil from drying winds and sun exposure. Mulching with straw, leaves, or brush was practiced to keep soil moist and cool, a technique that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of microclimate management. Seed selection and preservation were critical components of peasant adaptation. Experienced peasants carefully saved seeds from drought-tolerant plants or those that had survived previous hard seasons. These seeds were preferred for planting the following year, gradually shaping a local stock adapted to the region's harsh conditions. Such selective breeding was an unintentional but vital form of agricultural innovation. The saved seeds also included varieties that matured quickly, allowing peasants to harvest before the dry season fully set in. Peasants also adapted their crop choices according to drought conditions. While wheat was a staple grain, it was sensitive to dry spells. As drought worsened, peasants increasingly turned to hardier crops like barley, millet, rye, or legumes, which could better tolerate limited water. These crops formed the backbone of survival diets in lean years, providing essential nutrients and calories. Their cultivation required different tools and methods, forcing peasants to maintain flexible knowledge and skills across various crops. Local wisdom extended into pest and disease management during drought, when weakened plants were more susceptible to infestations. Peasants used herbal repellents and companion planting to discourage pests naturally, avoiding the destruction of scarce crops. They also monitored plants vigilantly, pulling diseased or infested specimens before contagion spread. Such vigilance was a form of early integrated pest management, reflecting the community's deep engagement with their environment. Another key innovation was the use of fallow periods in crop rotation, practices that helped soil recover and reduced the risk of total failure. While fallowing was often enforced by feudal customs, peasants recognized its value in drought years as a deliberate strategy rather than mere obligation. Allowing land to rest reduced strain on depleted soils and conserved moisture for future planting. Rotation with legumes not only improved soil fertility but also broke cycles of pests and diseases, giving crops a better chance to survive the harsh conditions. Communal knowledge and resilience. The transmission of these agricultural innovations relied heavily on oral tradition and communal learning. Villagers shared experiences, compared results, and advised one another during gatherings or seasonal work. This collaborative knowledge exchange created a collective wisdom that was vital in times of drought. Elders were respected repositories of this knowledge, their memories and observations forming a living archive of adaptation strategies. Innovation was not confined solely to agriculture. Peasants adapted their social organization and labor practices to meet the demands of drought survival. Work schedules shifted to cooler parts of the day to reduce exhaustion and conserve water. Communal labor exchanges became essential for managing the increased workload required to implement water-saving techniques, maintain terraces, and repair irrigation channels. These cooperative efforts strengthened social bonds and distributed the burden more equitably across the village. Some peasants experimented with small-scale irrigation, diverting water from streams or springs to their fields through simple ditches or channels. While large-scale irrigation was beyond their means, even minor efforts to bring additional moisture to crops could make the difference between survival and failure. These irrigation efforts required coordinated labor and maintenance, further reinforcing the importance of community cooperation in drought resilience. Adaptation also extended to livestock management. Peasants adjusted feeding practices to cope with pasture shortages, relying on stored fodder, tree leaves, or agricultural byproducts. They might reduce herd sizes to lessen pressure on limited resources, prioritizing animals that provided milk or labor over those kept primarily for meat. Such decisions were painful but necessary, reflecting the difficult trade-offs imposed by drought. These adaptive strategies were neither universal nor foolproof. Success depended on many factors, including the severity and duration of drought, the quality of the land, and the availability of communal resources. Some villages fared better due to advantageous geography, social cohesion, or stronger leadership. Others succumbed despite their best efforts, overwhelmed by the harshness of nature and the limits of human ingenuity. Nevertheless, the peasant innovations and adaptations in tools, planting methods, water management, and social organization underscore a crucial truth. Medieval peasants were not passive victims of drought but active agents of survival. Their intimate relationship with the land, their ability to observe, learn, and modify their practices, and their reliance on community cooperation constituted a resilient, if fragile, defense against one of the most relentless challenges of their time. In the end, the story of how medieval peasants survived deadly droughts is not only a tale of suffering and loss but also one of human creativity and endurance. The hands in the soil, rough, calloused, and determined, shaped not just the land but the very possibility of life in a world often hostile to those who tilled its fields. From drought to flood, when rain finally returned to medieval peasant lands. After the long, relentless drought that had left fields cracked and barren, wells drying to mere trickles, and village life strained to its breaking point, the skies finally opened, and rain returned. This moment was met with a mixture of profound relief, cautious hope, and immediate practical challenges. For medieval peasants, the end of a drought didn't mean an instant return to prosperity or ease. Rather, the reappearance of water brought its own complex risks, from floods and soil erosion to the urgent demands of rebuilding shattered livelihoods. The transition from drought to flood was a delicate, precarious phase requiring renewed labor, careful planning, and resilience. When the first drops fell after months of parched earth, villagers often gathered outdoors, faces uplifted to the sky, eyes moist with tears of joy and exhaustion. The smell of wet soil, the scent of life returning, was overwhelming, a potent reminder of nature's capricious power. Yet this welcome relief was shadowed by the knowledge that sudden, heavy rains on dry, hardened ground could bring dangerous consequences. The soil, baked and compacted during the drought, was often unable to absorb the water quickly. Instead, water ran off rapidly, leading to flash floods that washed away topsoil, damaged buildings, and threatened to undo the fragile gains made through months of hardship. The risks of returning water. Flooding after drought was a common occurrence in medieval Europe and could devastate vulnerable villages. Riverbanks, stripped of vegetation, were prone to collapse, sending torrents of water into fields and homes. Paths and roads turned into mud-choked rivers, isolating communities and disrupting trade or aid. The combination of sudden water surges and weakened infrastructure meant that peasants had to act quickly to protect their homes and fields. Earthen dikes or embankments, where available, were hastily reinforced. In some cases, villagers worked together to divert floodwaters using trenches or channels, trying to shield crops in settlements. Despite these dangers, the return of rain was fundamentally life-affirming. Water refilled wells and cisterns, replenishing the vital supply for drinking, cooking, and irrigation. Rivers and streams, once reduced to thin threads or dry beds, swelled with renewed energy, offering fresh fish and supporting wild plants essential to foraging diets. Peasants began to see the return of green shoots in their fields, and the hard-won crops planted late in the drought months gained a new chance to mature. This visible sign of regeneration sparked a cautious optimism that the worst was over. Rebuilding livelihoods and adapting practices. The transition to rainy conditions demanded immediate changes in agricultural practices. Fields had often been left fallow or overgrazed during drought, leading to soil exhaustion. With water available again, peasants had to carefully assess which plots could be replanted and how to rehabilitate depleted land. They applied layers of manure or compost collected from livestock enclosures to boost soil fertility, a practice critical to restoring productivity. Some villages instituted communal labor days to repair terraces and ridges damaged by drought winds in the early rains, recognizing that collective effort was necessary to reclaim fertile ground. Replanting was a key priority, but it was fraught with risk. Peasants had to choose fast-growing crops that could make the most of the short window before the next season, balancing the desire for food security against the threat of a new drought cycle. Grain crops such as barley and rye, along with hardy legumes, were favored for their resilience. Seed stocks were precious, so every decision mattered. The careful use of saved drought-tolerant seeds, passed down and selected over generations, once again became essential to survival. The rebuilding extended beyond fields and crops to the very structures of village life. Homes and barns, weakened by drought's heat and dust, often suffered damage from the sudden moisture. Thatched roofs soaked up water, sometimes collapsing under the weight or inviting mold and rot. Walls cracked under the rapid changes in temperature and humidity. Peasants had to repair these damages quickly, using locally available materials like wood, straw, clay, and stone. The task was labor-intensive and costly, especially in communities already depleted by months of hardship. Water management systems required urgent attention as well. Cisterns and rain barrels needed cleaning and repair to capture and store the newly abundant water effectively. Ditches and drainage channels clogged with debris from windstorms or erosion had to be cleared to prevent waterlogging and further flooding. The communal nature of many of these tasks fostered a sense of shared purpose and solidarity. Villagers organized working groups, often led by elder men or women respected for their knowledge of local conditions and traditional practices. In medieval Europe, a peasant's life was complete. The return of rain also impacted livestock management. Animals that had struggled through drought found fresh pastures and water, though the recovery was gradual. Pastures could be muddy and overgrown, increasing the risk of disease and injury, so peasants had to balance grazing pressure carefully. Rebuilding herd numbers was a slow process. Many animals had been sold or lost during drought, leaving families with diminished means for milk, meat, and labor. Breeding efforts resumed with great care to strengthen stock for future drought resilience. Enduring challenges and long-term impacts. Peasants' relationship with nature during this period was marked by both awe and anxiety. They understood that rain was both a blessing and a potential threat. Weather lore and oral traditions guided decisions: when to plant, when to reinforce dikes, and when to harvest. Rituals and prayers often accompanied the return of rain, thanking saints or invoking protection from floods. The spiritual and practical blended seamlessly, reflecting a worldview deeply tied to the land and cycles of nature. Markets and trade began to recover as well, though slowly. Droughts often disrupted supply chains and reduced surplus goods for sale or barter. With crops regrowing and livestock rebounding, peasants could gradually resume economic activities, exchanging foodstuffs, tools, and other necessities. However, prices often remained volatile, and poor harvests during drought years meant that debt and poverty lingered, limiting immediate recovery for many families. Health risks shifted as well. While drought had brought dehydration and malnutrition, the sudden wet conditions increased exposure to waterborne diseases and parasites. Stagnant pools formed by flooding could become breeding grounds for insects that transmitted illnesses. Communities had to manage these new threats with limited medical knowledge and resources. Herbal remedies, isolation of the sick, and hygienic practices rooted in tradition were their primary defenses. The ecological impact of moving from drought to flood was profound. Floodwaters redistributed nutrients, sometimes rejuvenating fields but also washing away valuable topsoil. The dynamic interplay of water and land shaped future agricultural decisions. Some peasants experimented with planting in low-lying areas newly enriched by silt, while others avoided flood-prone zones. Over time, villages adjusted settlement patterns to minimize risk, sometimes relocating homes or storage buildings to higher ground. Peasant resilience during this phase was remarkable. Despite the losses and setbacks, communities harnessed their collective knowledge, physical labor, and social cohesion to rebuild. The transition from drought to flood was not a simple reversal but a complex adaptation requiring flexibility and endurance. It was a testament to their intimate understanding of the environment and a powerful example of human perseverance in the face of relentless natural challenges. Bones in the field, when droughts turned catastrophic. Drought in medieval times was not merely a season of hardship, it could swiftly transform into a season of death. What began as parched earth and withered crops sometimes spiraled into full-blown catastrophe, leaving behind a landscape haunted by tragedy and bones scattered in the fields. When rain failed for months or even years, the resulting famine could overwhelm the already fragile peasant communities, breaking their capacity to survive and fundamentally altering the social fabric of the village. The journey from drought to disaster was brutal and often merciless, with consequences that echoed for generations. The connection between drought and famine was direct and immediate. Crops, the lifeblood of peasant sustenance, were the first casualties. In years when rains failed, fields cracked under the scorching sun, grain failed to ripen, and root vegetables shriveled. Food reserves, often meager even in good years, were quickly depleted. Peasants depended heavily on their harvests not only for immediate consumption but also for seed to sow the following year. Without a reliable harvest, the cycle of planting itself was threatened, setting in motion a cascade of shortages that could last well beyond the initial drought period. The spread of hunger and disease. As food stocks dwindled, hunger spread through villages like a shadow. Initially, families would ration their remaining supplies, stretching bread and pottage to fill empty stomachs. Children and the elderly, the most vulnerable, often suffered first and most severely. With weakened bodies came greater susceptibility to disease. Malnutrition lowered immune defenses, allowing common infections such as dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis to claim more victims. These illnesses, usually manageable in times of plenty, turned fatal in famine conditions, compounding the death toll. The psychological toll of starvation was equally devastating. Hunger gnawed not only at bellies but also at hope. Families watched loved ones waste away, powerless to intervene. Mothers faced the torment of seeing their children weaken, and many were forced to make harrowing choices in the desperate hope of saving some. Reports from medieval chronicles and accounts hint at heartbreaking scenes: parents giving up children to charity, the elderly left alone, and neighbors reluctantly turning away those too weak to contribute to the community's survival. This breakdown of social cohesion was one of the many tragic consequences drought-driven famine inflicted. In the most extreme cases, starvation led to death on a massive scale. Entire villages could be decimated by famine, their fields left untended and homes abandoned. The skeletons uncovered in archaeological digs across Europe attest to the grim reality of such catastrophes. Mass graves, hastily dug, tell stories of lives cut short in their prime. Bones found scattered in fields suggest the desperate attempts of those dying to reach water or food sources. The aftermath of these famines was a landscape scarred by loss and silence. Societal challenges and environmental degradation. Medieval society was ill-equipped to handle these calamities. Unlike modern states with organized relief systems, medieval communities relied heavily on local resources and social networks. When those networks were overwhelmed, there was little recourse. Lords and nobles sometimes provided relief in the form of grain or money, but their aid was often insufficient or delayed, and frequently came with expectations of continued labor or service. Church charity offered some help through alms and hospitality, yet the scale of need often outstripped available resources. The tragedy of famine extended beyond immediate mortality. Survivors often faced long-term health consequences, including stunted growth, chronic weakness, and lowered fertility. The population of affected areas could decline significantly, leading to labor shortages that disrupted agricultural production and further weakened local economies. These demographic shifts sometimes altered the balance of power within regions, as depopulated areas became vulnerable to invasion or consolidation by stronger lords. Conflict often flared in the wake of famine. Scarce resources bred resentment and competition. Peasants might resist feudal demands for tithes or labor when they themselves faced starvation, sometimes sparking rebellions or localized violence. Theft of grain or livestock increased as desperation grew, and law enforcement struggled to maintain order in communities fraying at the edges. Such social unrest added another layer of tragedy to already shattered lives. Religious interpretations of these catastrophes often intensified the sense of despair. Many peasants believed famine was divine punishment for communal sins or failures. This belief could foster fatalism, undermining efforts to adapt or seek alternative solutions. At the same time, it galvanized religious leaders to call for penitence, prayer, and processions, attempts to appeal to God's mercy. While these rituals offered spiritual comfort to some, they could not prevent the physical realities of hunger and death. The environmental degradation caused by prolonged drought and famine also left lasting scars. Overused and exhausted fields, stripped of vegetation, became prone to erosion and infertility. In some regions, once fertile lands turned barren for years or decades, forcing peasants to abandon traditional plots and seek survival elsewhere. This environmental decline compounded the tragedy, limiting future food production and deepening poverty. Desperate survival and lasting legacy. Yet, even amid such calamity, peasants did not surrender easily. Their survival strategies became more desperate and inventive. When grain failed, many turned to foraging for wild roots, nuts, and berries, knowledge of which was passed down through generations but rarely enough to sustain entire communities. Others resorted to hunting small game or fishing where possible, though these resources were often insufficient. Trade sometimes provided limited relief, as merchants brought grain from less affected areas, but this was contingent on political stability and market access. Some peasants sought refuge beyond their villages. Migration, both seasonal and permanent, became a survival strategy for those with the means or the strength to leave. Traveling to towns, monasteries, or wealthier estates in search of work, food, or charity, these wandering peasants embodied the human toll of drought-induced catastrophe. However, such movement was fraught with peril. Travel was difficult and dangerous, and newcomers were often met with suspicion or hostility. Medical responses to famine and drought-related illness were rudimentary. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, and religious rites were common treatments but offered little real protection against the ravages of starvation and disease. The lack of effective medical care meant that once illness took hold in malnourished individuals, mortality rates soared. The sheer scale of death during catastrophic droughts overwhelmed local capacities for care and burial. The cultural memory of these disasters was preserved through oral traditions and, occasionally, in written chronicles. Songs, stories, and local legends remembered the times when bones lay in the fields and the earth drank no rain. These narratives served as warnings and lessons, reminding future generations of the precariousness of life and the ever-present threat of nature's fury. They also shaped community identity, fostering resilience through remembrance and shared experience. Despite the overwhelming tragedy, these catastrophes occasionally led to broader social changes. Labor shortages sometimes empowered surviving peasants to negotiate better terms with their lords or move to more favorable regions. In some areas, famine-induced mortality weakened rigid feudal structures, opening paths for economic and social mobility. However, these shifts were uneven and often took decades to manifest, offering only small consolation amid the immediate devastation. The bones left in the fields were silent witnesses to the harsh reality of drought-turned catastrophe. They told of lives ended prematurely, of families shattered, and of communities struggling to hold together amid relentless adversity. Each skeleton was a testament to the vulnerability of medieval peasants and the unforgiving power of nature. The legacy of these tragedies underscored the fragile balance between survival and collapse in a world where a season without rain could mean the difference between life and death. Endurance in the dust, reflections on resilience and the human spirit during droughts. Throughout medieval history, the unyielding march of drought posed one of the greatest challenges to peasant communities across Europe. The long stretches of parched earth, cracked fields, and empty wells didn't just threaten crops and livestock. They tested the very endurance and spirit of those who lived closest to the soil. Yet, amid the harsh realities of scarcity, suffering, and uncertainty, medieval peasants exhibited remarkable resilience, harnessing both practical ingenuity and deep-rooted hope to survive seasons when the sky withheld its blessings. Understanding this endurance reveals much about the human capacity to adapt and persevere in the face of relentless adversity. Drought was a relentless adversary that struck without mercy or warning. Its impacts were not merely physical but penetrated every aspect of daily life, shaking the foundations of medieval peasant society. The loss of harvests meant hunger. Hunger bred weakness. Weakness threatened survival. Yet, even in the darkest stretches of drought, peasants did not succumb passively to fate. They became agents of survival, cultivating endurance in their hearts and actions alike. Communal bonds and practical adaptations. One of the key elements fueling this resilience was the deeply communal nature of peasant life. Villages were more than clusters of dwellings. They were interdependent networks of families who shared labor, resources, and knowledge. During drought, this communal spirit intensified. Food, water, and tools were pooled, and those with more helped those with less. This reciprocity was not just an act of charity but a strategic imperative. Ensuring the survival of the community as a whole meant preserving the labor and life of every member. It was in these networks of mutual aid that the seeds of endurance were planted and nurtured. The very fabric of daily work also reflected adaptability. Peasants adjusted their routines and priorities to suit the dry conditions. Labor that depended on water, such as irrigation or certain crop cultivation, was reduced or modified. Instead, emphasis shifted toward tasks that conserved energy and resources, such as repairing tools, maintaining storage facilities, or gathering wild foods. The rhythms of work bent and stretched to accommodate the demands of drought, illustrating a pragmatic flexibility essential for survival. This endurance was also deeply rooted in a connection to the land that was at once practical and spiritual. Peasants possessed intimate knowledge of their environment, understanding subtle signs that foreshadowed rain or prolonged dryness. They observed the behavior of animals, the wilting of specific plants, and the color of the sky, interpreting these as part of a natural dialogue. This wisdom, accumulated over generations, provided a guide for making critical decisions about planting, harvesting, and rationing. Beyond observation, many peasants engaged in deliberate land management practices that demonstrated an early form of ecological adaptation. Crop rotation, fallowing fields, and planting drought-resistant species were among the techniques used to conserve soil moisture and maintain productivity in dry years. These methods did not eliminate the hardship caused by drought but softened its blows, underscoring a profound human capacity to work with nature's cycles rather than against them. Spiritual and mental fortitude. The endurance of medieval peasants was also buoyed by spiritual resilience. Faith was a cornerstone of medieval life, and the presence of drought, often seen as a trial or punishment from God, did not lead to despair but to sustained religious devotion. Prayer, fasting, and participation in rituals were acts of hope and resistance, expressions of a belief that perseverance in faith would eventually bring relief. Saints were invoked, processions organized, and collective worship offered as a means to unite communities and bolster morale. This spiritual dimension served as an emotional anchor. When physical resources dwindled, faith provided a reservoir of strength that allowed peasants to face each day's challenges with courage. It fostered patience and acceptance without resignation, enabling communities to endure dry spells that might otherwise have fractured social bonds. The Church, through its leadership and rituals, acted as both a spiritual guide and a social stabilizer during times of drought. Mental endurance, however, was not without its struggles. The psychological toll of persistent drought manifested in anxiety, grief, and despair. Peasants lived with the constant threat of loss, of crops, livestock, children, and even themselves. The uncertainty bred sleepless nights and desperate prayers. Yet the endurance of spirit was evidenced in the ways communities confronted these challenges, through storytelling, music, and collective mourning that allowed for shared expression and healing. Oral traditions flourished during these times, offering both comfort and instruction. Tales of past droughts and survival strategies were recounted, binding present hardships to a continuum of human experience. Songs and stories infused with hope and resilience helped transform suffering into a shared narrative of endurance. These cultural expressions were not mere distractions but vital tools for psychological survival, ingenuity, economic navigation, and lasting legacy. Moreover, the endurance of medieval peasants was manifest in their creativity. Faced with diminishing resources, they devised innovative ways to stretch food, capture scarce water, and make do with what they had. From the use of rain barrels and cisterns to the cultivation of drought-tolerant crops, peasants demonstrated an ability to invent and adapt that was crucial for survival. These innovations, though often simple, were products of careful observation and experimentation born from necessity. Economic endurance was also critical. The hardships of drought often meant negotiating with landlords, bartering goods, or taking on additional labor to secure basic needs. Peasants showed remarkable resourcefulness in managing debts and obligations during lean years, sometimes delaying rents or pooling labor to meet communal goals. Their ability to navigate the complex web of feudal demands under duress exemplified a tenacity that was essential to weathering drought-induced crises. Social structures, while strained, provided additional layers of endurance. The authority of village elders, communal councils, and the church helped coordinate efforts and mediate conflicts arising from scarcity. Leadership during drought required balancing firmness with compassion, ensuring that survival strategies did not fracture the social fabric. In many cases, the solidarity forged in these times would strengthen communities long after the rains returned. Importantly, endurance was not merely passive acceptance but an active struggle against despair. Peasants resisted the erosion of hope by maintaining routines, celebrating small successes, and preparing for the eventual return of abundance. The anticipation of rain, even if distant, sustained efforts and prevented surrender to fatalism. This forward-looking resilience was a testament to the indomitable human spirit. The legacy of medieval peasant endurance under drought is a profound reminder that survival in the face of environmental hardship is as much about psychological and social strength as it is about physical resources. Their stories of courage and adaptation, though often overshadowed by grand historical narratives, illuminate the power of community, faith, and ingenuity to overcome even the most relentless trials. In examining the endurance of medieval peasants, one also recognizes the deep continuity of human resilience across time. The challenges they faced resonate with contemporary struggles against climate variability and environmental crises. Their example encourages a holistic understanding of survival, one that embraces not only technical solutions but also the nurturing of spirit and social bonds. Ultimately, the dust-covered fields of medieval Europe bore witness to countless stories of endurance, of people who refused to yield to drought's harsh decree. Through shared labor, faith, knowledge, and hope, they carved out existence on a landscape that often seemed hostile and unforgiving. Their legacy is one of persistence, reminding us that the human spirit, when united and resolute, can endure even the driest of days. Thanks for joining this deep dive into how medieval peasants survived deadly droughts. Through 20 detailed segments, we've explored their daily struggles, resourcefulness, and resilience in the face of relentless hardship. From conserving every drop of water to adapting crops, from relying on faith and community to enduring mental and physical tolls, their story reveals the incredible strength of the human spirit under pressure. What part of this journey resonated most with you? Did any particular story or detail surprise you? Maybe the ways they predicted drought through nature's signs, or how they coped emotionally with famine and despair. Or perhaps the social challenges of feudal obligations during times of scarcity struck a chord? I'd love to hear your thoughts, reflections, or questions. How do you think these medieval survival strategies compare to challenges we face today? Do you see parallels in modern droughts and climate struggles? Drop your comments below and share your perspective. Your insights help keep these forgotten histories alive and relevant.